The wedding hall was supposed to be the end of a war. Instead, it became the beginning of something far more dangerous. The moment the veil fell from her face, every wolf in the room went still. Not from awe, from fear. And Ronan Vale, the most feared alpha king in the frozen north, felt something crack open inside his chest that he had spent 30 years keeping sealed shut. He had married a ghost. A myth. A creature his people hunted for centuries. And now, the entire world was coming to take her back. If you've ever wondered what it costs a king to choose love over survival, stay until the very end. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's begin. The wolves smelled the southern convoy 3 hours before it reached North Fall's iron gates. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it swallowed. The North Fall mountain range in late frost month was a wall of gray stone and white silence, the kind of landscape that had broken entire armies over the centuries. Soldiers who had survived a dozen battles on open plains had been found frozen to their saddles on the North Fall passes, their eyes still open, still searching for the road that never came. But the convoy moved steadily. 19 carriages, 42 mounted guards, 1 bride. Ronan Vale watched them from the eastern battlement, his hands braced on the stone railing, his breath rising in slow, deliberate clouds. He was not a tall man by the standards of southern courts, those marble-columned places where height was measured in posture and silver thread. But in the north, where size was measured by how much punishment a body could absorb and keep moving, Ronan Vale was enormous. Broad shoulders, thick arms, a jaw that had taken more than a few fists without so much as a crack. His hair was dark, always slightly too long, always escaping whatever had been done to it the morning before. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of morning fog, but the hard gray of iron ore before it's been worked into something useful. He watched the convoy and felt nothing in particular. "She's smaller than I expected," said Brennan, coming to stand at his right shoulder. Brennan Ashvale was Ronan's second-in-command, his oldest friend, and the only man in the Northern Territories who could speak to the Alpha King without being invited to do so and survive. He was leaner than Ronan, quicker in most things, with a soldier's economy of movement and a diplomat's irritating tendency to find the appropriate thing to say. "You can't see her from here," Ronan said. "I'm speaking about the carriage. It's small, for a noblewoman." Brennan tilted his head slightly. The southern courts usually send their daughters with enough luggage to fill a small harbor. This one travels light. Ronan said nothing. He watched the lead carriage pass through the outer gate, and he noted that Brennan was right. The procession was careful, efficient, almost military in its spacing. No excess, no performance. That was unusual. "Her name is Elira Voss," Ronan said, because saying it out loud was the only way he had learned to process things he didn't want to think about. "Second daughter of House Voss, 23 years old. No notable military or political record." He paused. "She's been chosen because her elder sister refused the arrangement." Brennan made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Romantic." "This isn't romance." Ronan pushed himself back from the battlement. "This is the end of a 7-year war that's cost my people 11,000 lives. I'll stand at an altar, speak the words, sign the documents, and we'll have peace along the southern border before winter breaks." He turned away from the view. "That's all this is." Brennan watched him go. "Of course," he said to the empty air. "That's all it ever is." The Great Hall of North Fall Keep had been decorated for the occasion with what Ronan privately thought was excessive optimism. Someone, he suspected his head housekeeper, Marta, who had been trying to soften the keep's interior for 15 years with limited success, had arranged white flowers along every available surface, mountain blooms, forced open in heated rooms, pale candles in iron sconces, tapestries beaten clean of their usual coating of northern dust. The result was something that looked almost warm, almost welcoming, in a hall that had spent most of its existence being neither. The guests filled the space with careful correctness. Northern lords stood on the left side of the central aisle, their faces carrying the specific expression of people who were attending an event under political obligation and preferred everyone to know it. Southern delegates occupied the right, wearing the elaborate layered fashion of the lowland courts, and looking vaguely hypothermic despite the fires burning in every hearth. Ronan stood at the front of it all, in formal blacks, and waited. He had gone through weddings before, twice, At the edges of his long memory, ceremonies of political alliance that had ended in death before they could end in anything else. He did not think about those. He had learned early and with significant pain that there were categories of loss that had to be placed in sealed rooms inside the mind and never revisited. He stood at the altar and waited for the doors to open, and he rehearsed in his head the treaty language, the border agreements, the trade concessions, the things that mattered. The doors opened. The music began. Low strings, northern style, nothing celebratory, just steady. And the procession entered. Southern Guards first, walking in pairs. Then the Voss family representative, an older man with the gray face of someone who had been traveling for too long and sleeping too little. Then attendants, then her. The veil was traditional Southern fabric, thin, pale, barely opaque. Ronan could see the suggestion of a face beneath it. The shape of someone slight, moving carefully, as though the stone floor beneath her feet required close attention. What he noticed first was her posture. Not perfect, not the trained, practiced carriage of a court-raised woman who had been taught since childhood to present herself. It was something more natural and more difficult to name, a kind of interior stillness, as though whatever she was carrying inside her was heavy enough to require careful balance. She reached the altar. She stood beside him. The officiant began to speak. Ronan was listening to the words. He was paying attention. This was important. This was the point. But something else was happening at the edge of his awareness. Something his wolf instincts had been trained to notice before his human mind caught up. A scent. Ancient and cold and electric, like the air before a lightning strike on a frozen lake. Like something that had no business being in a warm, candlelit hall in the middle of a political wedding. His wolf stirred. Not with aggression. With something closer to recognition. Impossible, he thought. The officiant reached the central vows. The traditional moment. "Remove the veil," the older man said, "and face your bond." The attendant beside Alyra Voss reached up and lifted the fabric away. Ronan looked at her. She looked at him. Her eyes were the color of deep water. Not blue exactly, more a blue-gray silver that seemed to catch light that wasn't there, like the surface of a glacial lake under a clouded moon. Her face was pale, sharp-featured, composed. She couldn't have been called beautiful in the obvious way. Not the kind of face that stopped rooms. But there was something about the structure of her, the way the light seemed to find her, that made it difficult to look away. She seemed to be having a similar problem. For 3 seconds, Ronan counted them, because counting was something to do that was not whatever else was happening. Neither of them spoke. Then Alyra Voss said very quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the music still playing, "You're taller than I expected." And something in Ronan Vale's chest, something he had spent 30 years learning to ignore, cracked open like ice in spring. "So I'm told," he said. The officiant, somewhat desperately, continued the ceremony. The vows were spoken. The signatures were made. The witnesses spoke their confirmations. And somewhere in the formal architecture of the proceedings, in the moment when the blood bond was sealed, a northern tradition, a small cut on each palm, hands pressed together, the bond acknowledged before witnesses, Ronan felt it. Not pain, not warmth, something older and stranger than either, a pull, deep in the marrow of his wolf nature, as though something that had been unmoored for a long time had just found an anchor. He looked at Alyra. Her face had gone very still. "Do you feel—" he began. "Yes," she said. Her voice was barely a breath. "I didn't know it would do that." Before he could ask what that meant, what she had expected, what she knew, what she wasn't saying, the first scream came from the back of the hall. Ronan had spent his entire adult life in conditions where survival depended on the speed of instinct over thought. Before the scream had finished echoing off the stone ceiling, he had already moved, one step to the left, body turning, one hand reaching for the blade at his hip, that protocol said he wasn't supposed to be wearing at his own wedding, but that 15 years of border war had made impossible to leave behind. "Down, dirt!" he shouted, to the hall, to everyone, to no one specific. The back doors had burst open. Not with the noise of a battering ram. No siege weapon this. No army. Men in black, slim and precise, moving through the hall like oil through water. 8 of them. Then 12. armed with blades and with something else. Small metal devices that hissed as they moved, releasing a gray vapor that was already making the southern guests choke and stagger. Assassination formation, the tactical part of Ronan's mind noted, with cold clarity. Not killing everyone. Moving through. Targeting. Targeting what? He turned back to Alira. She had not run. She had not hidden behind an attendant or dropped to the floor. She was standing exactly where she had been standing for the vows, perfectly still, and her eyes had gone very wide, and she was watching the approaching figures with an expression that was not quite fear. It was recognition. "They're here for you," Ronan said. Not a question. "They're always here for me," she said quietly. "I just didn't expect... Not tonight. Not here." "How many times?" "This is the 4th attempt." Her voice was very controlled. Too controlled, the way things get when control is all there is left. "The first was when I was 16. A house fire. The second was a poisoned water supply. That one took the servants." She paused. "I'm sorry. I should have told your people. I should have..." "Later," Ronan said, because later was all he could offer her right now, and also because the nearest assassin had just separated from the pack and was moving directly toward them, blade drawn, moving fast. Ronan moved faster. It had been a long time since he'd fought in formal clothes, but some things the body remembered without being asked. He met the first assassin at the edge of the altar platform, took the blade strike on his forearm guard, turned his body into the man's momentum, and put him on the stone floor with a force that removed him from the conversation entirely. The second came from the left. Brennan materialized from somewhere to the right. Brennan always materialized from somewhere when it mattered, and dealt with him with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this since adolescence. The hall had dissolved into chaos. Northern lords were drawing weapons. Southern delegates were retreating toward the walls. Somewhere in the back, a woman was screaming in a language Ronan didn't recognize. 3 more assassins converged on Alira, not on Ronan, who was the Alpha King and the larger physical threat, on her. Ronan killed the first one before he reached her, wounded the second. The third got past him, got close enough to grab her arm, to press a blade to her throat, to shout something in a dialect that took Ronan's mind half a second to translate. "Starborn. You end here." Everything stopped, not metaphorically, not in the theatrical, heightened emotion sense, actually stopped. The assassin went rigid. His breath froze in his lungs. The blade at Alira's throat, still pressed against her skin, was suddenly covered in a thin layer of frost, growing outward from the point of contact like crystals forming in fast forward. The man's hand was locked. His feet were locked. Every part of him that touched or threatened Alira Voss had turned to a photograph of itself, suspended, immovable. Alira stepped away from him slowly. Her left hand was outstretched, palm up, and the air around it shimmered with something that was not quite light and not quite cold. Something in between those two things that had no name in any language Ronan spoke. She looked at the frozen man, then at her own hand, then at Ronan. Her expression for the first time since he'd met her was not composed. It was terrified. "That wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "Not here, not where people could..." She was looking at the hall, at the northern lords and southern delegates and servants and guards, all of whom had stopped fighting to stare. All of whom were watching her hand, watching the frozen man, watching the frost on the blade. "Starborn," someone breathed from somewhere in the crowd. The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Ronan watched the ripple of it move through the room, watched faces go pale, watched hands move, not toward weapons exactly, but away from comfort, toward old reflexes, old fears. The Starborn were not a children's story in the North. They were not abstract mythology. They were the creatures his ancestors had written about in careful, terrified script. Beings born with a fragment of something cosmic, something that was not meant to live in a human body, that burned through the body it occupied and everything around it. Ancient, dangerous, illegal under Northern law for 2 centuries. The woman he had just married, the woman bleeding slightly where the blade had pressed before she'd stopped the arm that held it, was one of them. Ronan looked at Alira Voss. She was still watching him with that terrified expression, and beneath the terror was something else. Something that looked heartbreakingly like resignation, like someone who had long since accepted that this was how every story ended. He could see her calculating it already, the retreat, the retraction, the apology, preparing herself for what came next. He stepped between her and the hall. "My wife," Ronan Vale said, in the voice he used when he needed a room to hear him and a room to obey, "just saved her own life. Anyone who has a problem with the method can come and discuss it with me directly." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence before. He turned to Brennan, who was staring at him with an expression that was difficult to read. "Get the prisoners secured. Get the hall cleared. Send for Marta. She'll want to examine the wounds." He paused. "And someone put out the fire near the east tapestry before it reaches the ceiling." Brennan looked at the tapestry, which was indeed beginning to smoke. "Right," he said. "Yes, of course." Ronan turned back to Elira. She was still standing very still, her hand no longer glowing, the frost on the captive assassin already beginning to melt. Her face was pale. There was a thin line of red along her collarbone where the blade had kissed her skin. "Are you injured?" he asked. She blinked, as though the question had surprised her. No, not seriously. Are you fine?" He studied her for a moment. "You should have told me." "I know." Her voice was steady now, but barely. "I'm sorry. I thought I had it under control. I've had it under control for years. It doesn't usually—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "It doesn't usually respond like that, not unless I'm—" Another stop. "Unless you're what?" She looked up at him, those deep water eyes, catching light that wasn't there. "Unless I'm frightened," she said, "or unless someone I care about is in danger." A pause. "I don't know why it did it for you. We've known each other for 20 minutes. Ronan thought about the pull in his chest when their hands had touched, the recognition in his wolf. The thing he'd told himself was impossible. "I might have a theory about that," he said. "They cleared the hall in 40 minutes. The dead were moved, the wounded were treated. The frozen assassin, who had, by degrees, thawed back to a state of terrified consciousness, was removed to the lower cells for questioning. The surviving guests were given the choice of accommodation in the keep's guest quarters or immediate departure. Most of the southern delegates left before midnight. Several northern lords also made their exits, with expressions that communicated, without requiring words, that they would need to think carefully about their next political moves. Brennan organized all of it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent a decade managing crises and had developed a certain philosophical relationship with chaos. Ronan and Elira were given an hour with the keep's physician, who cleaned Elira's wound and confirmed that it was superficial. The physician, an older woman named Yael, who had served 3 Alpha Kings and had the battle-worn directness to show for it, examined Elira's hand, the hand that had done the freezing, with a professional expression that concealed whatever she actually thought. "Any numbness?" Yael asked. "Any pain in the extremities?" "No," Elira said. "I'm fine. The power passes through me. It doesn't stay." "Has it always?" "Since I was 11. Yael looked at Ronan. He gave her nothing. She gave him back a very small nod and left. Alone in the physician's room, a narrow, warm space off the main corridor, smelling of herbs and treated leather, Ronan and Elira sat on opposite sides of a low table and looked at each other. "How many people know?" Ronan asked. "In my family. My father, my older sister. The family physician who first identified it. 3 others." She paused. "And apparently whoever sent those men tonight. The cultists." He'd heard Brennan identify them, from the symbol cut into their armor, a half circle with a jagged line through the center. The sign of the Hollowed, the faction that had spent 3 generations hunting the Starborn. "They've known about you for a while. Since the first attempt, when I was 16. Elira's hands were folded in her lap. "My father believed the arrangement today would help. That removing me to the north, to a different political sphere, might make the trail harder to follow." She paused. "I think he was wrong." "Your father sent you here to use me as a shield," Ronan said, without particular heat. Just the fact of it. She didn't flinch from that. He appreciated that she didn't flinch. He sent me here because he had run out of other options, she said. Whether that's different, I leave to you to judge. Ronan looked at her across the table. The candle between them had burned low. The keep was quiet in the way it got after violence, a watchful, processing silence, the sound of a place absorbing what had happened. He thought about the 7 years of border war, 11,000 dead, the treaty that was supposed to close all of it. He thought about the word starborn dropping through the silence of the hall like a stone, and the faces turning. He thought about the pull. The blood bond, he said. During the ceremony. You felt it. Yes. Do you know what it does? Elira was quiet for a moment. I know what it does in folklore, she said carefully. I know what the starborn texts say, the ones I've been able to find. They say that when a starborn forms a bond with an alpha wolf, the two forces— She stopped, chose different words. They don't cancel each other out, they calibrate, like two different instruments finding the same frequency. Another pause. I had hoped that was metaphorical. It isn't, Ronan said. She looked at him directly. No, I don't think it is. A long silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like the silence of two people who have had a great deal of information handed to them in a short period of time and are in the process of sorting it. I'm not going to send you away, Ronan said finally. She blinked. I didn't expect— I'm also not going to pretend tonight was normal, or that there's no danger, or that the people who sent those men won't send more. He met her eyes. What I'm going to do is deal with it. That's what I do. That's what this place does. Elira looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not trust, exactly. Not yet. It was too soon for trust. But something in the direction of trust's early preconditions. The willingness to wait and see. All right, she said, quietly, steadily. All right, he agreed. Outside the narrow window, Northfall was dark and cold and utterly indifferent to what had just happened inside its walls. The mountains did not care about Starborn or treaties or blood bonds or assassins. They stood as they had always stood, patient and permanent, waiting for whoever was left standing when everything else was done. Inside the physician's room, two people who had been strangers for their entire lives sat across a low table with a candle burning between them and began, slowly, carefully, without any particular ceremony, the process of figuring out what came next. The morning after the wedding brought Northfall Keep into a condition Ronan recognized from the aftermath of battles. The specific combination of exhausted clarity and logistical urgency that followed violence. People moved through corridors with purpose. Conversations happened in low, fast voices. Marta had already organized the cleaning of the Great Hall and was producing a casualty list with the thoroughness of someone who had done this before. Ronan reviewed the list in his war room, standing over the long oak table that held the maps and documents of his territory's ongoing concerns. 6 dead among the guests, 3 northern, 3 southern, 14 wounded, most of them minor, 2 of the assassins dead, 4 captured, including the frozen one. Brennan came in while Ronan was reading the report on the captured prisoners. He poured himself something hot from the pot by the fire and sat at the corner of the table. The hollowed, Brennan said. I confirmed it from 3 of the 4. The 4th isn't talking. He'll talk, Ronan said. Probably. But even without him, we know the organization. We know their reach, more or less. What we don't know is how they found out about her. Brennan paused. Or what exactly she is. Ronan set down the report. Starborn. I know the word, Brennan said evenly. I'd like to know what it means in practice, since we apparently have one living in the keep now. Ronan told him what he knew, which was the combined sum of his memory of the old texts, what Elira had told him the night before, and what he had felt in his own bones when the blood bond had sealed. He spoke plainly. He didn't minimize it. When he finished, Brennan was quiet for a while. So the bond between you is real, Brennan said. Yes. And it affects you both. Yes. And the people who want her dead have been hunting her for 7 years and now know she's here. Yes. Brennan looked into his cup. and the lords who were at the ceremony last night saw what she did. Yes, Ronan said. That's the most immediate problem. It was. The Northern Lords were not a homogeneous body. Some would follow the Alpha King's lead without question on most matters. They had proved that through the war years, through taxes and sacrifices and decisions that were never easy. But the Starborn was different. The Starborn touched something older and more instinctive than political loyalty. It touched fear. And fear, in politics, was highly communicable. 3 of them sent messages before dawn, Brennan confirmed, with the tone of someone delivering unpleasant news they have organized into its most useful form. Theron of Eastwall, the Hollis twins, and old Marchetti. He paused. Theron's message was the most direct. He used the word abomination. Ronan's jaw tightened. He also said, Brennan continued carefully, that he speaks for 7 lords who were not present at the ceremony, but who have already heard through their networks, and that these 7 lords share his concern. His concern, Ronan repeated, and the flatness in his voice was its own kind of weather. His concern, Brennan said, that the Alpha King has taken a Starborn as queen, has defended her publicly, has allowed her to remain in the keep, and has shown no inclination to address the political and legal implications of the legal implications, Ronan said, of my wife existing. Brennan pressed his lips together. Yes. Starborn status hasn't been a capital offense since the 4th era, Ronan said. My great-grandfather revoked those statutes. Your great-grandfather did. The Hollowed cult disagrees with your great-grandfather on several points. Brennan set down his cup. And while the lords aren't the Hollowed, most of them, hopefully, they share enough of the old anxiety to be a political problem. If 7 lords are already in motion, and the Hollowed are already in motion, and the treaty with the South is now deeply uncertain because her presence here was never disclosed to your delegation, he paused. Ronan, this is not a small situation. No, Ronan agreed. It isn't. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. The Northern Territories, laid out in careful ink, all of it that he had spent his adult life protecting, the villages, the trade routes, the borders. All of it that the 7-year war had been fought to keep safe. All of it that 11,000 people had died to secure. He looked at the map and thought about the woman in the physician's room the night before, saying all right in a voice that had been braced for something much worse. He thought about the pull. Get me a meeting with Theron, he said, and the 7 lords. All of them here within a fortnight. Brennan raised an eyebrow. And the message? Tell them the Alpha King invites them to a council. Tell them nothing else. Ronan picked up the casualty report again. And tell Yael I want her assessment of the blood bond's physical effects. She'll have observations she hasn't shared yet. Brennan stood. And the Hollowed? We're going to find out who in the South gave them information about Elira's location and the wedding date, Ronan said, because someone in House Voss's circles sold that information, and I'd like to know who before they do it again. He picked up his pen. The morning's work had barely started. Elira found her way to the Eastern Library by mid-morning. She had slept briefly, or tried to. The guest chambers she'd been given were large and cold and decorated with the specific aesthetic of a room that had been hurriedly prepared, the kind of neutral comfort that communicated we ran out of time to think about this. She'd lain in the dark and listened to Northfall's sounds, the wind against the stone, the movements of guards on their rounds, the deep, structural, settling noises of a very old building. She'd thought about the frozen man, about her hand, about the expression on Ronan Vale's face when the hall had gone still and everyone was looking at her. She had expected in that moment what she had always expected in that moment, the withdrawal, the recalculation, the specific shift in a person's face when they moved from this is someone I know to this is something else. She had watched it happen 4 times in her life with people who had mattered, and she had learned to brace for it the way you braced for a wave you could see coming. Ronan had not done that. He had stepped between her and the hall. She was still, hours later, not sure what to do with that. The library was large, larger than she'd expected from the exterior of the keep, which was so aggressively functional in its architecture that it seemed to have no room for anything soft. But the library was clearly old and clearly loved, shelves from floor to ceiling, a gallery level above, tables worn smooth by decades of use. Books that had been treated well and books that had been treated as tools, both present in equal measure. A fire burning in the hearth. She spent an hour at the section covering northern folklore and historical records. She found what she was looking for. The old texts on Starborn, the ones she hadn't been able to access in the South, and she sat at the nearest table and read with the focused, slightly desperate energy of someone trying to build a map of territory they're already standing in. She was halfway through the third volume, a scholarly commentary from the Third Era, written by a Wolfkin historian named Aldrich Moss, when she heard the door. She looked up. It was not Ronan. It was a young woman, perhaps 17, with dark hair pulled back severely and the kind of sharp watchfulness in her expression that Alira had learned to recognize as the look of someone who has grown up around danger and developed early opinions about it. The girl came directly to Alira's table, looked at the books. "You're reading Aldrich Moss," she said, as though this were a verdict of some kind. "Yes," Alira said. "He got the kinship sections wrong," the girl said. "He thought the bond was metaphysical because he never observed it in practice. He was working from secondary sources." She paused. "I can show you the corrections, if you want. There are marginalia in the fourth volume." Alira looked at her. "Who are you?" "Senna," the girl said. "I help in the library. I also—" A brief pause, a small recalibration. "My mother was a scholar. She studied Starborn history before she died. She left her notes here." She looked at Alira with those sharp, evaluating eyes. "I know what you are. I've been studying it for 6 years." A beat of silence. "The bond your husband felt," Senna said, "when the blood seal was made. You felt it too?" "Yes." Senna nodded as though this confirmed something. "Then Moss was wrong about the sequence," she said, sitting down across from Alira without being invited and pulling the fourth volume toward her. "He thought the Alpha Bond preceded the Starborn awakening. He thought the Wolf Force had to be established first, as a—" She searched for the word container, but my mother's notes say it works the other way. She found a page covered in precise small handwriting in the margins. They reach each other simultaneously. The Starborn power calibrates to the Wolf, and the Wolf calibrates to the Starborn. Neither one has to go first. Alira looked at the marginalia, then at Sina. "Your mother," she said carefully. "Where did she find this information?" Sina's expression for just a moment shifted. Something behind those sharp eyes that was older than 17 had any right to be. "She found it from the last Starborn who lived in the north," she said, "before they were all hunted out." A pause. "Before my mother was killed for helping them." The fire crackled. The wind moved against the stone outside. "I'm sorry," Alira said. "I'm not telling you for sympathy," Sanaa said practically. "I'm telling you so you understand that there are people in this keep who know what's happening and are not afraid of it." She met Alira's eyes. "And people who are afraid of it, but are keeping their mouths shut because the Alpha King said so." "That's a small majority," Alira said. "Small is enough," Senna said. "For now." She turned back to the marginalia and began to explain her mother's corrections. Alira listened, and for the first time in a long time, since before the convoy, before the mountain road, before 3 days of travel during which she'd sat in the small carriage and counted the ways this arrangement would end badly, she felt something that was not quite hope, but was in the neighborhood of it. Ronan came to the library at midday. He found Alira and Senna at the center table surrounded by books, both of them talking with the velocity of people who have discovered they have a great deal in common and not enough hours in the day. He stopped in the doorway and watched them for a moment. Senna looked up first. "The fourth volume confirms the simultaneous calibration theory," she said to Ronan, with the directness of someone who had never been intimidated by authority and was not planning to start. "Your wolf instincts will be running ahead of your rational mind for the next few weeks. You'll notice things about her, her moods, her location, her distress, before she tells you. You need to not act on every impulse or she'll feel surveilled." Ronan looked at her. "Good morning to you too, Senna." "It's technically afternoon. The library clock is accurate." "I know," Ronan said. He moved to the table, looked at the spread of books, looked at Alira, who was watching him with that still, water-gray gaze. "How are you sleeping?" "Not well," she said. "How are you?" "The same." He pulled a chair and sat, which surprised both of them. He could tell from the small adjustment in their posture, the slight recalibration of expectations. The Alpha King, sitting at a library table with his new wife and his library scholar, in the middle of an afternoon that contained, somewhere in its architecture, the beginning of a war. "Tell me what you know," he said to Alira. "Not the official record, what you actually know about the Hollowed, about why they want you, about what they believe you can do." She looked at him for a moment. Then she set her hands flat on the table and began to speak. She spoke for nearly an hour. She told him about the texts she'd found in her family's restricted archive at 14, the ones that used the word starborn in historical context rather than as a slur or a myth, about the small manifestations of power that had started at 11. Frost on windows, lights flickering, temperatures dropping without cause in rooms she occupied. About her father's reaction, which had been fear first and then a very careful, very private management of the situation. About the scholars he'd hired to study her quietly, under other pretexts. She told him about the first attack at 16, which she had survived because the power had erupted without her directing it, and she hadn't understood what she'd done until afterward. About the 2 years that followed, during which she'd learned, slowly, painfully, with the help of 2 scholars and a great deal of controlled, terrifying experimentation, that the power was not random. It responded to her emotional state. It was strongest when she was frightened or when someone she cared for was threatened. She told him about the loneliness of it. She said this last part plainly, without drama, in a voice that suggested she had already processed most of the feeling and what remained was just information. Ronan listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not offer comfort at the moments when comfort would have been easy and probably unwanted. He listened with the specific quality of attention of someone who is treating what he hears as intelligence, important, potentially life-saving, requiring full engagement. When she finished, he said, "The Hollowed believe the Starborn can destroy kingdoms." "They believe the Starborn will destroy kingdoms," Alira corrected quietly. "They believe it's inevitable. Not malicious, just structural. That the power is too large for a human body to contain indefinitely, and that when it finally overflows, it won't discriminate." "Is that true?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "I don't have a reference point for what I become, if the power fully awakens. I've only ever experienced it in fragments." She paused. "The text Senna showed me suggests that with the bond, with the calibration, it doesn't have to be destructive. The wolf force acts as an anchor," Ronan said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Did you feel that last night?" "When I stepped between you and the hall," he said, "I wasn't thinking about anchor dynamics. I was thinking about the fact that someone had just put a knife to your throat." A pause. "But yes, there was something. A steadying." Alira looked at him across the table. Senna was very quiet. "The Hollowed aren't wrong that I'm dangerous," Alira said. "They're wrong about why." She held his gaze. "If the power consumes me, it's not because it's evil. It's because there's nothing holding it to me, nothing giving it a reason to stay contained." She paused. "The bond changes that." Ronan looked at her for a long, level moment. "Then we protect the bond," he said, as simply as if he were discussing the fortification of a wall. Alira blinked. Something moved across her face, not quite surprise, but the near relative of surprise, the expression of someone who had expected the harder answer and is still processing the easier one. "That's not how most people respond to this information," she said. "Most people aren't me," Ronan said. He stood. "I have meetings, lords to deal with. I'll be back for the evening meal." He looked at Senna. "The 4th volume. Does Moss's predecessor agree with your mother's corrections?" Senna blinked, apparently adjusting to this shift in conversational gear. "Harlan's commentaries? Partially. He gets the timeline right but misunderstands the emotional dynamics." She paused. "He thought the alpha feeling was protective instinct. My mother believed it was more complex than that." "Of course it is," Ronan said, without any particular expression, and left. There was a short silence in the library after the door closed. "He's not what I expected," Alira said. "No," Senna agreed, with the tone of someone stating a well-established fact. "He never is." Bah. The evening meal was quiet. The great hall was still being put back to rights. The tapestry near the east wall had been taken down and was being cleaned. The stone where the scuffle had happened most intensely had been scrubbed but retained a careful observer's attention. They ate in a smaller dining room off the main corridor, Ronan and Alira and Brennan and Yael, a functional gathering with food brought by a young servant who seemed determined to be invisible. The conversation was mostly tactical. Brennan reported on the prisoner questioning. Yael reported on the blood bond's observable physical effects. In Ronan, she had noted heightened sensory acuity, slight elevation in ambient body temperature, and what she clinically described as enhanced directional awareness, by which she meant he kept angling himself unconsciously toward wherever Alira was in the room. In Alira, she had noted elevated vital signs during the previous night's events, a sustained temperature drop in her immediate environment. Frost on the window panes of the physician's room had taken 4 hours to fully melt, and what she described as unusual stillness, by which she meant Alira's resting state was abnormally calm for someone who had just survived an assassination attempt. "That's not abnormal for me," Alira said when Yael finished. "I've spent 10 years learning to keep the power quiet." "Still is. A practiced state." Yael nodded. "That makes sense of several things I noticed," she said, and went back to her food. Ronan ate and listened and watched Alira across the table, and thought about anchors. He thought about the lords who were already sharpening their political knives, and the cultists who were already sharpening the other kind, and the treaty that had been supposed to end 7 years of suffering and was now hanging in the balance. He thought about 11,000 dead and the people who had died so that there might be peace. He thought about a woman who had spent 10 years teaching herself to stay still so that the power inside her wouldn't consume everything she touched. He had said we protect the bond as though it were simple. It was not simple. He understood that already, in the architecture of what Brennan had told him, in the Seven Lords' messages and the Hollowed's gathered armies. But he had meant it. Outside, Northfall's night had come down hard and clean, the mountains sharp against a sky full of frost-bright stars. Inside the small dining room, a fire burned in the hearth, and 4 people ate and talked and thought, each of them carrying the knowledge of what was coming. The alliance had begun in a hall full of flowers and violence. What it would become, that was still being written. The council demand arrived on the 4th morning. Not a request. A demand, written in the formal language of Northern law, sealed with 7 different house crests pressed into black wax. Ronan read it at his war table before dawn, standing in his shirt with a cup of cooling tea at his elbow, and the particular stillness that settled over him while he read it was the kind that Brennan had learned over 15 years to find more alarming than any display of temper. The document stated, in the careful, multi-layered phrasing of men who wanted their meaning clear but their culpability obscured, that the lords of the Northern Coalition requested an urgent council at Northfall Keep to discuss the matter of the Alpha King's consort and her apparent nature, and that this council should occur before the week's end, and that the Alpha King's response to this request would be taken as a measure of his regard for the stability and safety of the Northern Territories. Ronan set the document down. "They're not asking," Brennan said, from the chair by the fire, where he had been since before Ronan woke, which meant he had been there all night and had not slept. "The language is a request, but the structure is an ultimatum." "I know what it is," Ronan said. "Theron wrote the final draft. I can tell from the sentence construction." "He studied law in his 20s. Brennan paused. "The 7 lords are now 9. 2 more joined the coalition overnight." "Which 2? "Pharaoh of Westkeep, and your cousin Davin." That landed. Not because Ronan had expected better from Davin. His cousin was a political creature in the way some people were born left-handed, naturally and without apology, but because Davin's inclusion changed the coalition's legal standing. Davin held the oldest bloodline title in the Northern Territories after Ronan himself. His presence gave the 9 lords a constitutional argument that their gathering wasn't mere political theater. Ronan picked up his tea, drank it cold. "When can we have them here?" "If you send riders today, the day after tomorrow." "Send riders today." He set down the cup. "And tell Senna I need access to the Third-Era statutes on consort rights, the specific language around alpha bonding and its legal precedence over council motions." Brennan's eyebrows shifted slightly upward. "You're going to cite consort rights?" I'm going to be prepared to cite them, Ronan said, which was different. Whether I use them depends on what the 9 lords say when they're sitting in front of me. Brennan stood, stretching with the careful movement of someone whose back had made certain opinions known about the night chair. And Elira? Ronan looked at the document on the table. At the 7, now 9, black wax seals. She should know, he said. She'll find out regardless. I'd rather she hear it from me. He found her in the eastern courtyard. It was early enough that the keep was still in its pre-morning state. That interval when the night watch was finishing and the day staff was beginning, and the building existed briefly between its 2 versions of itself. The courtyard was empty except for Elira, standing near the far wall where the stone caught the first gray light, her breath making small, careful clouds. She was not doing anything, just standing, hands loose at her sides, face tilted slightly upward toward the mountain ridge, where the sky was beginning its slow transition from black to the particular deep blue of northern pre-dawn. She looked like someone doing something very internal and very focused, and Ronan slowed his approach without consciously deciding to. He stopped a few feet away. She didn't startle. "You knew I was coming," he said. Not quite a question. "I heard the door," she said. "And I felt—" She paused. "The bond. I feel it when you're close, like a change in air pressure." She lowered her head and looked at him. "Is that going to be awkward?" "Probably," he said. "I have it too. Brennan told me I've been orienting toward you in rooms without noticing." A small quiet passed between them. Not uncomfortable. The courtyard held it without difficulty. "There's been a development," he said. "I know." At his look, she explained, "Senna came to find me last night. She heard about the second message before I did." She turned to face him fully. 9 lords. Your cousin is one of them." "Yes." Elira was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance. In the growing light, her face was very clear. All its careful composition. All the places where she'd trained herself not to show what she was actually thinking. He was getting better in these 4 days at reading the things underneath. Right now, underneath the composure, there was something that was not quite fear and not quite resignation, but was made of the same materials as both. "They'll ask you to send me away," she said. "Probably. And if they don't ask, they'll imply. And if they don't imply, they'll legislate." She said it plainly, without bitterness. The way someone states a pattern they have observed multiple times and verified. That's how it always works. The people who can't come at you directly find the structural mechanism. She paused. "Your cousin holds the secondary bloodline title. Legally, he can bring a council motion to challenge consort standing if he has 8 supporting lords." "He has 8. "Yes, I know." She looked at Ronan. "I studied Northern constitutional law for 6 months before the wedding. My father's scholars thought it might be relevant." A brief, dry pause. They were more right than they knew. Ronan studied her face. The mountain ridge behind her was catching the first actual light now, the very tips of the peaks going pale gold while everything below remained in shadow. "You're not going to tell me not to fight it," he said. "It's not my place to tell you what to do about your own council," she said. "It's your kingdom. It's your life." Something shifted in her expression. Just slightly. "Yes," she said. "It is." She held his gaze. "But I've been surviving attempts on it for 7 years without a council or an alpha bond or any of this. If you decide the political cost is too high—" "I'm not deciding that," Ronan said. "I know," she said. "But I want you to know that I understand the calculation. I'm not going to be the thing that costs you everything you've built." She paused. "I'm telling you that so you know there's a door if you need it." Ronan was quiet for a moment. The gold on the mountain peaks was spreading, moving down the rock in degrees. "I don't need it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, a single, quiet motion. Not relief, exactly. More like a person setting down something they'd been prepared to carry and discovering they didn't have to. "Then I should probably start thinking about what to wear to a council where 9 men are going to argue about whether I should exist," she said. "Something that doesn't frost the furniture," Ronan said. She turned back toward the keep. "I make no promises," she said, and there was, very briefly, something in her voice that was almost a smile. The 2 days before the council were dense with work and with a kind of watchful quiet that settled over Northfall like weather. The 9 lords sent ahead their staff and their riders with the efficient advanced logistics of men preparing for a confrontation they intended to win. Northfall's corridors, already learning the rhythms of their new occupants, added these new presences with the careful neutrality of a place that had hosted conflict before and knew how to hold it without choosing sides. Alira spent the time in the library with Senna, working through the constitutional texts with focused, systematic determination. Ronan, observing this, at a distance, because Yael's observation about the bond's directional awareness had lodged itself in his practical mind, and he was making a deliberate effort not to hover, thought that she approached legal research the way she approached most things, quietly, thoroughly, without waste. Senna matched her pace and exceeded her in enthusiasm, occasionally running between shelves with the velocity of someone who had been waiting for years for someone else to care about her mother's research. Ronan worked his own problems in parallel. He met with Brennan each morning. He reviewed the reports from the cells where the 4 captured assassins were being held. 3 of them had now provided information, and the picture forming from that information was not good. The Hollowed had known about Alira for longer than 7 years. They had known since her birth, or close to it. The informant inside House Voss had been in place for over a decade, and the army the cultists had been building, the army that Brennan had mentioned with the careful neutrality of someone describing a very large, very cold body of water that someone is about to be pushed into, was not a raiding force. It was an occupation force, organized, supplied, disciplined, currently positioned, according to the most recent intelligence, at the southern edge of the mountain passes, 3 weeks' march from Northfall. When Ronan told Brennan this, sitting over maps in the war room on the second day, Brennan said with impressive calm, "So the 9 lords are the smaller problem." "The 9 lords are the immediate problem," Ronan said. "The army is the real one. We can't fight a war on 2 fronts." Brennan looked at the map. "Not after 7 years of border conflict. The men are rebuilt, but the supply lines are not. If the Hollowed move on Northfall while the Northern Coalition is internally fractured, then we lose," Ronan said simply. "Yes, I know." Brennan looked at him. "So we need the council to go well. We need the council to go better than well. We need it to go—" Ronan paused, looking at the map, at the distance between the mountain passes and Northfall's walls. "We need to come out of that room with 9 lords who are more afraid of the army at the gates than they are of the woman in the library. And if we can't achieve that through argument," Ronan looked up from the map, "then we achieve it through demonstration," he said. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to show them what she can do." "If it comes to that." "She'll hate that," Brennan said. "Not a judgment, a fact." "Yes," Ronan said. "That's why it's a last resort." He looked back at the map. "Talk to the intelligence officers in the south. I want a clear estimate of the Hollowed Army's movement timeline, and I want it before the council." The lords arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. They came in their own time and their own sequence, which was itself a political statement. A unified arrival would have suggested coordination, which would have been too legible. Instead, they spread their arrivals across a 3-hour window, each lord and his retinue processing through the keep's main gate with the studied nonchalance of people being very careful about what they communicated through their posture. Ronan received them in the formal entrance hall, standing, not seated, another choice, communicating that this was not a reception, but a meeting of equals, and that he had not arranged himself for comfort. He greeted each lord by name. He did not mention the coalition. He did not reference the document. He was courteous and precise and gave none of them anything to read in his expression. Davin came last. He was 3 years younger than Ronan, the same broad build, the same dark coloring, but arranged differently, more polished, more careful, the kind of man who had invested heavily in presentation as its own form of power. He embraced Ronan with the practiced warmth of family, and Ronan embraced him back with equal professionalism, and they stood and looked at each other for a moment with the specific quality of 2 people who know each other well enough to know exactly what the other is doing. "You look tired," Davin said. "I've been busy," Ronan said. "I heard the wedding had some excitement." "Something like that." Ronan studied his cousin's face. Davin's expression was concerned, which was real enough. Davin cared about the North, genuinely, in the complicated way of someone who wanted to lead it and believed he would do it well. That wasn't performance. "We'll talk in council, Davin." "Of course," Davin said, and smiled, and the smile almost reached his eyes. The council chamber was one of Northfall's oldest rooms, circular, stone, built for exactly this purpose 3 generations back. A round table, 11 chairs, windows set high in the walls to let in light without offering views. The roundness was deliberate, no head of the table, nominally. The Alpha King's chair was slightly larger, but only slightly. Ronan sat. The 9 lords sat. Brennan stood at the room's edge, as was traditional for a king's second. 2 scribes, 2 guards at the door. Lord Theron of Eastwall opened proceedings. He was a compact man in his 50s, gray at the temples, with the manner of someone who had done his preparation and was confident in it. He began formally, as the author of the coalition document, acknowledging the Alpha King's hospitality, noting the gravity of the situation, invoking the council's constitutional mandate. He was good at this. Measured, credible, not aggressive in tone. His argument, stripped of its formal layers, was as follows. The Northern Territories had been under significant strain for 7 years. Peace had been the singular goal. The arrival of a starborn as Alpha Queen, under conditions that suggested deliberate concealment by House Voss, represented a destabilization far worse than continued border skirmishes. The hollowed cult would take this as a casus belli. The Northern people would take this as evidence of their king's compromised judgment. The council therefore respectfully requested, he used the word requested, but the word sat in the room the way a drawn sword sits on a table, that the Alpha King consider the terms of a formal annulment. He finished. He folded his hands. He waited. The room was very quiet. Ronan let the quiet extend. He had learned long ago that rooms will fill silence with anxiety, and anxious rooms are easier to read than composed ones. 3 of the lords shifted in their seats. One cleared his throat. Davin, to Ronan's left, was very still. "Thank you, Theron," Ronan said. "I'd like to ask a question before I respond." Theron inclined his head. "Of course. Who among you has seen the intelligence report from our southern operatives about the Hollowed Army's current position?" A pause. "We were not provided with such a report," Theron said. "No, you weren't." Ronan looked around the table. "I received it 2 days ago. I'll share it now." He looked at Brennan, who produced copies, 11 of them, prepared because Ronan had decided 2 days ago that this was where the meeting would go if the council went the direction it was already going. The documents were distributed, the room read. Ronan watched the faces, watched the calculation shift, the specific recalibration of a room that has just received information that changes the shape of the problem it was assembled to solve. 3 weeks. An occupation force, organized and supplied and moving. That was not the raiding party scale they had assumed when they drafted the coalition document. That was something much larger. Lord Pharaoh of Westkeep looked up first. He was the youngest of the 9, mid-30s, with the practical face of someone who had earned his title through competence rather than inheritance. "This force is aimed at Northfall," he said. "Yes," Ronan said, "not at the southern border." "No," Ronan paused. "They're not here for territory. They're here for my wife." The phrase "my wife" dropped into the room with deliberate weight. Ronan used it with intention. Not the starborn, not the consort, not the careful neutral language the coalition document had employed. My wife. 2 words establishing a position. "They will cross our territory to reach her," Ronan continued. "Everything that stands between them and Northfall, every village, every farming community, every road settlement, is in their path." He looked at Theron. "You asked me to consider annulment. I ask you to consider the following. Annulment does not stop an occupation force. It does not close the passes. If we send a Lyra away, the Hollowed still come. They come angrier, because now they know we know about them, and they no longer need to be careful." He paused. "And they come to a Northfall that is internally fractured because we will have spent the last week arguing about whether my wife deserves to be here instead of preparing a defense." Theron's expression was difficult to read. He was thinking. Ronan could see it. There is another concern, Davin said. His voice was smooth and careful. He had been waiting, Ronan knew, for the right moment, and he had chosen it well. After the military information, in the new silence, before anyone could consolidate around it. The power itself, not the cult's army. What she carries. He looked at Ronan with the expression of a man who genuinely believed what he was saying and knew it would be hard to hear. If the starborn power fully awakens without control, the history is clear. The Third Era records describe what happened at the White Crest settlement. Moss's account, Ronan said. Davin blinked. Yes. Which was based on secondary sources, compiled 40 years after the event by a scholar who had never observed Starborn directly, and whose specific error regarding the bond calibration sequence has been documented in the marginalia of... Ronan paused, because he was about to cite a 17-year-old girl's dead mother's annotations, which was a sentence that required careful presentation. In subsequent scholarship, the White Crest incident occurred because the Starborn in question was isolated. No bond, no anchor. He met his cousin's eyes. The bond changes the structural dynamic entirely. Devin looked at him for a moment. And you're certain of this? I'm certain enough to stake the keep on it, Ronan said, which is what I'm doing. Another silence. A different quality to this one. Not the managed silence of a room waiting to be convinced. The harder silence of a room that has heard something it didn't fully expect and is deciding what to do with it. Lord Pharaoh spoke again. The army, 3 weeks. What's the defense plan? And there it was. The pivot. The room choosing, or beginning to choose. Ronan could feel it. The subtle shift in orientation around the table, the way a river changes against a redirected bank. I'll lay it out in detail after this meeting, Ronan said. The short version, we hold the passes, which requires the forces of at least 4 of the northern houses, in addition to the keep's own complement. We maintain supply lines through Eastwall, which requires Theron's cooperation. And we need the Hollowed to believe, when they arrive at the edge of our territory, that what they're about to fight is unified. He looked around the table. Not 9 lords arguing about annulment in a council room while an army walks through their villages. The room absorbed this. Theron was quiet for a long moment. Then he said carefully, the annulment motion is tabled until the military situation is resolved. It was not a victory, it was a postponement, conditional and specific, and every person in the room understood the conditions it contained. But it was enough. Thank you, Ronan said. Just that. No satisfaction, no performance of relief, just the acknowledgement and the move to the next thing. Brennan will distribute the defense plans. After the council, after the lords had been housed and fed, after the defense maps had been pored over and the supply estimates had been argued about, and the preliminary agreements had been made with the careful imprecision of people who were cooperating under pressure rather than from conviction, Ronan found Alira in the library again. She was alone this time. Senna had gone to eat. The room was lit by the late afternoon light coming through the high windows and by 2 lamps on the reading table, and Alira was sitting very still in the way he'd come to recognize as her internal work, the practiced stillness of keeping something managed. She looked up when he came in. How did it go? She asked. He told her. Concisely. The coalition's argument, the intelligence report, the room's shift, the tabled motion. She listened without interrupting, her face doing what it always did when she was processing, composing itself toward clarity, holding the emotion at some careful interior distance. When he finished, she said, You used the army. Yes. Not me. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't make them look at me and decide I wasn't dangerous. You made them look at something more dangerous and decide I was useful. That's a more clinical framing than I'd use, Ronan said. It's accurate, though. Yes, he said, because it was. The council was never going to accept you on principle. Not in a week, maybe not in a year. But they can accept you as part of a defensive strategy while the army is a problem, and that time can be used to build something more durable. He looked at her. Unless you find that unacceptable. Alira looked at the table, at the books spread across it, the marginalia, Sina's careful notes. No, she said. It's not unacceptable. It's honest. She paused. I'd rather know where I stand than be given a comfortable story. She looked up at him. What's the defense plan? Hold the passes, east wall supply lines, 4 houses committing forces. He sat in the chair across from her, which was not what he'd planned to do. He'd planned to give her the summary and return to the war room, but the day had been long and the chair was there and the library was quiet. And you. And me, she agreed. How? I don't know yet, he said. I know what you can do in a crisis. I don't know what you can do when you're choosing to do it. He paused. Can you? Elira was quiet for a moment. I've never tried to deploy it intentionally, she said. I've only ever experienced it as a response. Threat, fear, and then it comes. She looked at her hands. I don't know if it works the other way. Senna's research, Ronan said. Her mother's notes. Does any of it address directed use? Some of it. The historical accounts describe Starborn who could use it intentionally, but those accounts are Third Era, and they all describe Starborn who had fully awakened. She looked at him. I haven't fully awakened. Whatever happened in the wedding hall, that was a fragment. A reflex. She paused. The full power is something I haven't touched. I don't know what it looks like. Would you be willing to find out? The question sat between them. It was a large question. Ronan knew that. It was in its way the largest question he could ask her. Larger than the wedding, larger than the bond, because those had happened to her. This was asking her to choose, to walk toward the thing she had spent a decade keeping at careful distance. Elira looked at him for a long time. Outside the library windows, the afternoon was going gold, the mountains catching the late light in the particular way they did at this hour. All their hard angles softened. I need to know what it might cost, she said. Not in danger to others. To me. Yael and Senna both, Ronan said. Full research. Everything they have, and you set the terms. And you'd be there, she said. Not a condition. More like something she was verifying. Yes, he said. She looked at her hands again, then at the books, then at him. Then yes, she said. I'm willing. The next 3 days had the texture of a held breath. The 9 lords settled into Northfall with the careful politeness of people observing a ceasefire they were not entirely sure was permanent. Meals were functional, conversations were managed, and the Great Hall, clean now, the replaced tapestry hanging slightly differently than its predecessor, operated with the specific efficiency of a space that had decided not to reference recent events unless absolutely necessary. Elira began working with Yael in the mornings. The physician had set up a controlled environment in one of the unused practice rooms. Stone floor, no fabric, the windows set open to the outside air regardless of the cold. Elira sat in the center of the room, and Yael sat at the edge with a leather notebook, and the sessions began. They were careful at first. Small. Elira focused on the sensation she'd described as the presence, the awareness of the power at the edge of her daily experience, and attempted to engage with it voluntarily rather than waiting for crisis to bring it forward. The results were modest and encouraging in equal measure. The temperature in the room dropped reliably when she focused. Small manifestations, frost on the windowsill, a thin rime of ice across the stone floor immediately around her, controlled, deliberate, and, notably, stable. It did not escalate without external cause. Ronan attended 3 of these sessions. He stood at the room's edge and observed, and the bond hummed in the background of his awareness with a quality he was learning to distinguish from his own internal weather. When Elira was focused and controlled, the bond was a steady current. When she pushed and the power moved closer to the surface, the bond became something more active. A pull, a warmth at his sternum, his wolf instinct orienting toward her with an attention that was not concern exactly, but was what concern was made from. He said nothing during the sessions. She didn't look at him while she worked. But after the 3rd session, when Yael had left to write her notes, and they were standing in the practice room with the door open and the corridor's warmer air pushing back the cold, Elira said, "It's easier when you're in the room." "I know," he said. "That should probably concern me," she said. "The dependency dynamic. It's not dependency," he said. "Or it's not only dependency." Yael explained the mechanics. He paused. The wolf instinct functions as a reference point for the power. It's not that you need me to do it. It's that having a stable reference point nearby makes the control easier. Alira considered this. Like a magnetic north, she said. Something like that. Well, she looked at the frost on the floor, already beginning to melt. It's a strange kind of marriage. All marriages are strange, Ronan said. Most of them just don't involve cosmic power dynamics. She looked at him, and there it was again. That almost smile. That thing that lived at the very edge of her composure. Was that a joke? A small one, he said. She looked at the melting frost. I'll try again tomorrow, she said. I want to see if I can do it faster. The production, not the control. She paused. If we have 3 weeks, I need to learn quickly. We have 3 weeks, Ronan said, and you're already learning faster than any account in the texts suggests. She looked at him. How do you know what the accounts suggest? I've been reading, he said. Something in her expression shifted, small but distinct. The look of a person encountering evidence that they have been thought about, specifically and in detail, and adjusting to this information. When? She said. You're in the war room until past midnight. Senna leaves the relevant volumes on my chair, he said. She has opinions about what I should be reading. Alira was quiet for a moment. Senna is remarkable, she said. Yes, Ronan agreed. She has been for years. Most people take a while to notice. Another silence, warmer than the room warranted. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's session starts at first light. Yes, she said. And then quietly, as he turned toward the door, Ronan. He stopped. Thank you, she said. For the counsel, for... She paused, and for a moment the composure thinned, just slightly, enough to see the thing underneath. For not making me feel like something that needed to be managed. He looked at her across the cold, half-lit room. You're not, he said. You're someone who needs to be understood. A pause. There's a difference. He left before she could respond. On the 7th morning since the wedding, the intelligence rider arrived. He had come hard, 2 horses burned through, a 3-day ride compressed into 2. And he arrived with the specific bearing of a man carrying information that has been eating through him the entire journey. Ronan received him in the war room, Brennan present, the map already spread. The hollowed army, the writer said, getting straight to it with the efficiency of someone too tired for preamble. They've moved. Not 3 weeks, my lord. The previous estimate was based on their pace as of 8 days ago. He looked at the map. They've accelerated, forced march. The outer intelligence puts them at the southeastern pass in... He paused. 10 days, perhaps 9. The room was silent. Brennan looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at the map. 9 days. 3 weeks had been workable. 3 weeks had been time enough to consolidate the Lord's cooperation, time enough for Alira to develop control, time enough to build a defense that wasn't a desperate holding action. 9 days was none of those things. Get the Lords, Ronan said. All 9 of them. Council room. 1 hour. Brennan was already moving. Ronan looked at the map. At the distance between the southeastern pass and North Fall's walls, at the villages along that road, at the positions of the 4 houses who had agreed in principle to commit forces, but had not yet moved them. His mind ran the numbers with the cold arithmetic of a commander who had been making these calculations since he was 19 years old. The numbers did not produce a comfortable answer. He looked at the map for a long moment. Then he folded it, tucked it under his arm, and went to find his wife, Boss. She was in the practice room when he arrived, mid-session, Yael in her corner with the notebook. The floor was sheeted with ice, more than the previous days, more controlled, extending further without the edges softening into puddles. Alira was standing at the center of it, hands raised slightly at her sides, her face entirely still, her breath coming in long, slow rhythms. The air in the room was different, not just cold. The quality Ronan had been learning to recognize, the electric ancient thing, the sensation of standing at the edge of something that had been waiting for a very long time. Her eyes opened when he entered. She read his face immediately. Or the bond read it, more likely, the current between them carrying the urgency before his expression could. How long? She said. 9 days, he said. Yael looked up from her notebook. Elira lowered her hands. The ice on the floor stayed stable, controlled, chosen rather than reflexive, and Ronan looked at it, and then at her. "Then we have 9 days," Elira said. There was something different in her voice. Not the careful stillness of the practiced composure, something underneath it coming through, quiet and ancient and entirely certain. The frost on the floor around her feet was not melting. Ronan looked at it, at her. 9 days, he agreed. Is it enough? Elira looked at her hands. The air shimmered around them, barely visible, a distortion rather than a light, like heat over stone in summer, but cold and silver and present. Ask me in 8, she said. 8 days. That was what she had asked for. 8 days to answer a question she had been afraid to ask herself for over a decade. She used every hour of them. The practice sessions moved from morning only to dawn through dusk, Yael present for the first half of each day, and Sanaa for the second, the two of them building a documentation that was part medical record and part historical scholarship, and entirely unlike anything either of them had assembled before. The frost on the practice room floor stopped melting between sessions. By the 4th day, it was permanent. A thin, clean sheet of ice that Elira maintained without thinking about it, the way a person maintains their breathing, automatically, in the background of everything else. The power was waking up, not the crisis reflex she had always known, not the eruption that came when fear or threat broke through her practiced stillness. Something more fundamental, something that had been pressed down for 12 years beneath layers of careful management, was rising now with the slow, inexorable pressure of water finding its level. She could feel it in her hands first, then in her chest, then in the quality of her attention, which was changing in ways that were difficult to describe, and that Yael documented in careful clinical language that Elira thought failed to capture the essential nature of the experience. What it felt like, when she tried to articulate it to Ronan on the 5th evening, was this. It felt like remembering something she had never consciously known. Like the knowledge was always there, she said. They were sitting in the small room off the main corridor that had become, without formal designation, the place they had their real conversations. Away from the council, away from the practice room, away from the structured logistics of days that were moving too fast. And the practice isn't learning, it's uncovering. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Is that frightening? She considered the question honestly. It used to be, she said, the idea of uncovering it. I spent so long managing it that the management became identity, almost. Keeping it contained felt like being a person. Letting it out felt like, she stopped, becoming something else. And now? Now I think I had it backward, she said. She looked at her hands. Containing it was the thing preventing me from being fully a person. The power is part of me. It's not a separate thing I've been holding. She paused. It's more like, I've been holding myself still to keep it from spilling, and the only thing that was ever going to spill was me. Ronan looked at her with that particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. Not soft, not sentimental, but fully present. The wolf instinct in his gaze, reading her the way it read everything, completely, without pretense. Senna's mother wrote about this, he said. I know. I found the section this afternoon. Elira met his eyes. She called it the second nature, not a power added to a person who is made of two natures and who has been living as only one of them. The hollowed want to destroy you before the second nature finishes waking, Ronan said. Not harshly, just the fact of it, as he always delivered facts. Yes, Elira said, because after it does, they believe I become something they can't kill. Do you believe that? She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the narrow window, Northfall's night was clear and cold and full of stars that looked closer in the mountain air than they had any right to be. I believe, she said carefully, that after it finishes waking, whether anyone can kill me becomes a secondary question. She paused. The primary question is whether I can keep it from consuming everything I love in the process of waking. The word love dropped into the room without fanfare, applied to an object she didn't specify and didn't need to. Ronan heard it. The bond carried it between them with the simple honesty of things communicated below the level of choice. Neither of them addressed it directly. They had been building something in these 8 days, or perhaps uncovering something, in the same way she was uncovering her second nature, and it was the kind of thing that required space around it rather than direct examination. "Tomorrow," he said, "the council, and then the passes." "Tomorrow," she agreed. The second council was different from the first. The first council had been a confrontation that became a negotiation. The 9 lords had arrived armed with their coalition document and their constitutional argument and their 7 years of accumulated anxiety about exactly this kind of situation. And Ronan had redirected them with intelligence and precision and the cold logic of a bigger threat. The second council was a war meeting. The intelligence had been updated twice more since the riders' arrival. The hollowed army was confirmed at 9 days, then 8, then the morning before the meeting, a final estimate arrived, 6 days. Possibly 5, if the weather in the southeastern passes held clear. The weather in the southeastern passes was holding clear. The lords came to this council with different faces than the first. The political calculation that had dominated the previous meeting, the careful positioning, the coalition signaling, the management of competing interests, had been compressed by the timeline into something more essential. 6 days concentrated a room's priorities considerably. Theron had maps of his own. Pharaoh had supply estimates. 2 of the other lords had ridden their past positions personally in the days since the first council and had specific intelligence about terrain and defensible points. Davin had spoken to 3 former military commanders who had fought the Hollowed in previous campaigns, smaller conflicts, and had brought their assessments. The meeting ran for 4 hours. It was, Ronan thought, the most productive council he had presided over in 5 years of presiding over councils. Threat had a clarifying effect on argument. The defense plan came together in its broad strokes. 4 houses committing forces to the southeastern pass, positioned at the 3 natural choke points Pharaoh's survey had identified. East wall maintaining the supply line and providing the reserve. 2 additional houses holding the northern approaches against the possibility, confirmed by intelligence as real, that the Hollowed had a secondary force intended to flank through the highland routes, and Northfall Keep itself as the final defensive position, garrisoned and provisioned for a siege if it came to that. The motion for annulment was not raised. It was not, Ronan noted, withdrawn. It existed somewhere in the room's unspoken architecture as a thing that had been postponed rather than abandoned. But it was not raised. What was raised toward the end of the 4 hours by Lord Pharaoh, quietly, practically, without the loaded language Ronan had been bracing for, was the question of Illyra's role in the defense. "You implied at the first council," Pharaoh said, "that she could contribute to a defensive action. I'd like to understand what that means in practical terms." Ronan looked at him. "It means," he said, "that the starborn power, directed and controlled, is a force multiplier that changes the strategic calculation for the Hollowed fundamentally. They have an army. We have a smaller force in better defensive terrain." He paused. "With her, that terrain advantage becomes significantly more pronounced." "The power is controlled," Theron said, carefully. Not quite a question. "Yes," Ronan said. Theron looked at him, then at the map. "All right," he said, with the manner of a man deciding to trust an assessment he couldn't independently verify, because the alternative was worse. "All right." That was the second time in a week that Theron had said "all right," in a way that meant something more complicated than agreement, and Ronan filed it in the category of things he was grateful for, without comment. After the council, Ronan went to find Illyra and discovered she already knew. She was standing in the practice room, alone. Yael and Senna had gone, the day's session complete. The room was cold enough that Ronan's breath showed when he entered, and the floor was entirely sheathed in ice now, not just at the center but edge to edge, perfectly flat and perfectly clear. The lamps on the walls had frozen in place, their flames burning within a thin shell of ice that somehow didn't extinguish them, burning cold orange light caught in crystalline walls. Illyra was standing at the room's center, not in the focused working posture of the practice sessions, but simply standing, arms at her sides, looking at the frozen lamps. "I didn't mean to do the lamps," she said when he entered. "I was thinking about tomorrow and it just..." She looked at her hands. Happened. The ice on the lamps was melting now, slowly, the flames warming their prisons from within. 6 days, she said. 5 more likely, he said. She turned and looked at him. The second nature was visible now, in the way it hadn't been 8 days ago. Not in any dramatic visual sense, but in the quality of her presence, something that her practiced stillness had been dampening for years. She was more there than she had been, more fully occupying the space she stood in. Pharaoh asked about me, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I told them you were controlled. You're not entirely sure of that, she said. I'm sure enough, he said. Which was true. It was not the same as certain, and she knew that, and he knew that she knew it. I need to tell you something, she said. Her voice was very level. About the full awakening. What Senna's mother's notes say happens. He waited. When the second nature fully wakes, Elira said, the accounts describe a threshold, a point at which the power exceeds the body's capacity to hold it in its current form. She paused. Not destruction, not explosion. More like a restructuring. The body changes to accommodate what it carries. What kind of change? The accounts aren't specific, they describe it as irreversible. She met his eyes. They also describe it as survivable with the bond in place. Without the bond, she stopped. The historical instances without the bond were not survivable. Ronan absorbed this. The practice room's temperature had stabilized. The melting lamps, the floor ice holding steady, the cold existing in equilibrium with itself. Like her, he thought. Learning equilibrium. You're telling me this, he said, because you think it might happen during the battle. I'm telling you this because if we're deploying my power in a full combat situation, not a practice session, not a controlled environment, but a real engagement with real pressure and real threat, she paused. The emotional conditions that accelerate the awakening will all be present, simultaneously. Fear. Threat to someone she cared for. She didn't say these things. She didn't need to. And if it crosses the threshold, Ronan said, what do you need from me? She looked at him. Something in her expression, the thing she'd been composed around for 8 days, the thing the second nature was made of, moved closer to the surface. Don't let go, she said, of the bond. Whatever you feel from my side of it, whatever it becomes, don't let it push you away. Stay. Yes, Ronan said, simply, without qualification. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the frozen lamps, burning cold inside their dissolving shells. I need 1 more day, she said. Let me have tomorrow. It's yours, he said. The hollowed came on the 5th morning. They did not come from the southeastern pass. That was the first thing. The thing that unraveled the plan in the first hour, before Northfall's forces had fully taken their positions. The intelligence had been compromised. The Southeastern Army, the main force, the one all the preparation had been oriented around. It was real, it was moving, but it was not the point. It was the distraction. The primary force had come through the highland routes, the secondary approaches that 2 northern houses were supposed to be holding. Came through in the night, silently, using knowledge of the terrain that implied guidance from someone who knew the northern passes well. Came through and neutralized both holding forces before dawn. Not destroyed, not killed to a man, but outmaneuvered and flanked and pushed back, their positions abandoned in the dark. The highland approaches suddenly, catastrophically open. The rider who brought this news to Northfall reached the gate 30 minutes before the hollowed advance force reached the outer walls. 30 minutes. Ronan had been awake since the 2nd hour of the morning. He received the news in the war room, took 12 seconds to absorb the full scope of the strategic reversal, and began issuing orders with the focused velocity of someone who had spent his adult life planning for the moment when a plan disintegrated and only the essentials remained. Seal the outer gates, he said. Get everyone inside the inner walls. Archers to the battlements. North and west approaches priority. Send a rider to Theron with the highland positions. He needs to redirect Eastwall's reserve. He looked at Brennan. Where is she? Library, Brennan said, already moving. Senna came to get me when the first rider arrived. Elira had felt something. The bond, she said. She said you were awake and moving, Ronan said. Yes. He was already at the door. I'll get her. You coordinate the gate. The lords are going to need... The lords can find me on the north battlement, Ronan said. That's where I'll be. Alira was not in the library. She was in the corridor outside it, already moving toward him when he came around the corner, her hair loose, dressed for movement rather than appearance, and in her eyes the thing that had been building for 8 days was fully present. No composure managing it, no practiced stillness keeping it level. Just her and the second nature standing side by side in the same body for the first time. The Highland routes, she said. Yes, they have the approaches. The outer defenses won't hold more than... He looked at her face. Are you... Tell me the plan, she said. He told her, walking, both of them moving through Northfall's corridors at speed while the keep assembled itself around them into a defensive posture. The outer gate forces. The battlement archers. Theron's redirected reserve, still an hour away at minimum. The southeastern army still moving, a second pressure point that would arrive while the first was still active. The reality, which he stated plainly because she required plainness and had always required it, they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and working with a redirected plan that had lost its foundation. What's left standing? She asked. The walls, the garrison, the 4 lords who are already here. He paused. And you. She nodded. They came out onto the north battlement. The hollowed advance force was at the outer wall already. She could see them from the battlements, dark armored, moving with military precision, setting up positions at the base of the approach. They had siege equipment, not heavy, not wall breakers, no artillery, but sufficient for a sustained assault on an undermanned defense. Behind them, further back, the larger secondary force was visible on the ridge road, moving down at a steady pace. An hour, perhaps less. The southeastern army was still 2 hours away, according to the last intelligence. If that intelligence was still accurate, which Ronan's expression suggested he was not fully confident about. Below, on the courtyard, the northern lords were assembling. She could hear their voices. Not panicked, these were military men, but urgent, the urgency of a situation developing faster than the plan had accounted for. She saw Pharaoh directing his personal guard to the east wall. Theron was speaking to a rider, composing the message for East Wall. Davin was looking up at the battlement, at her. His expression was the one she had seen in the council room, the specific combination of fear and calculation that made a person's face go very still. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the distance between them was 30 feet of vertical stone and 300 years of the thing his family had been taught to believe about what she was. She turned away from Davin. They know I'm here, she said. The Highland force. They came this way specifically. Yes, Ronan said. He was beside her at the wall, looking at the advance force's positioning. They want to reach you before you fully awaken. If they take the keep, they won't need to kill me in a full awakening. They can kill me now before I'm... She stopped, looked at her hands. The air around them was doing what it had been doing for 3 days. Shimmering, that silver distortion that was neither light nor heat, but something between them. Before this finishes... That's not going to happen, Ronan said. How are you going to stop Alira? He turned from the wall and looked at her directly. How much of the power can you deploy right now, in this moment, without the combat situation pushing it? She felt it. The second nature, awake and present, and no longer managed, standing at the threshold he had asked about the night before. Not crossed yet, but close. Enough, she said. Enough to hold the north approach? I don't know what holding an approach looks like from my side of this, she said. I know. Tell me what you can do, and I'll tell you how it fits. She took a breath. Cold air, filling her lungs, and the power moving with it. Easy now, available in a way it hadn't been 8 days ago. Cold, she said. I can lower the temperature over a significant area, not just frost, below survival thresholds if I push. She paused. Ice? Concentrated and directed. The wedding hall was reflex, 1 man, 1 point. I think I can do more now, more area, more force. She looked at the advance force below. I can make the north approach very difficult to move through. That's what I need, he said. Not a killing strike, a slowing. Buy Theron's reserve time to reach us. And if the full awakening, I'll be right beside you, he said. That's not changed. She looked at him. The morning light was coming over the mountains now. Northfall's brutal, beautiful dawn. The kind of light that made the mountains look like something painted rather than something real. In it, Ronan Vale looked exactly like what he was. A man who had made his choice and was not second-guessing it. She turned back to the north approach. All right, she said, tell them to clear the battlement. Ronan cleared the battlement. He did it himself, moving along the stone walkway and saying a single word to each archer and guard he passed. Down. And his voice carried the quality that made arguments redundant. They went. Brennan came to the battlement long enough to look at Elira and look at Ronan and say, in a very even voice, I'll be on the east wall if you need me, and leave without requiring a response. The lords below were watching, all four of them, Pharaoh with something approaching tactical assessment, Theron with the face of a man recalculating, Daven with the stillness of someone watching a thing he had argued against and was no longer sure he had been right to argue against. Senna appeared from somewhere. The girl had a gift for being present at significant moments, and stood at the far end of the battlement, out of the way, with her leather notebook and the expression of someone who intended to document whatever happened. Ronan stood beside Elira, close enough that the bond was immediate and clear between them. She could feel it, the wolf warmth, steady, the magnetic north. The anchor. She raised her hands. The temperature on the north approach dropped, not gradually, not in the creeping degree-by-degree way of the practice sessions. It fell with the authority of something that had stopped pretending to be subtle. And the hollowed advance force, 160 soldiers, disciplined and prepared and carrying the conviction of men who believed in their cause, felt it all at once. The effect on a force in the open, at dawn, in a mountain environment that was already cold, immediate and severe. Breath became visible in sudden thick clouds. Metal became painful to grip. The ground between the force and the walls turned from frost to ice in 30 seconds. Not slick ice, but layered, ridged, combat-unfriendly ice that changed the footing of every soldier on the approach. Animals screamed. The mechanical joints of the siege equipment seized. Elira pushed further. This was the part she hadn't done in the practice sessions. This was the part beyond the threshold of what she'd been willing to test in a controlled environment, because in a controlled environment, the consequences of getting it wrong were recoverable, and here they were not. She pushed past the familiar edge and felt the second nature move forward to meet the demand. Not erupting, not consuming, but answering with the quality of something that had been asked to exist fully for the first time and was finding, with some surprise, that it knew how. The air above the north approach changed color. Barely visible. A shimmer, silver gray, like the distortion above a flame, but cold and spreading. The advance force stopped, not because anyone ordered them to stop, because the human body has a limit for what it will walk forward into, and the leading soldiers had reached that limit, and their legs had made the decision before their minds could override it. One man kept moving. A commander from the quality of his armor, the way the others organized around him. He walked forward through the cold and the ice and the changed air, and his courage was real, and Elira acknowledged it without sentiment. And then she directed the ice at the ground directly beneath him, and it rose in a column that caught his leg at the shin and stopped him mid-stride as cleanly as a wall. He looked up at the battlement. He looked at her. Starborn Eki. Starborn, he shouted, his voice carrying up the approach with the specific quality of a man invoking a word as an accusation and a battle cry simultaneously. The Starborn is in the keep. Forward, forward, for the hollowed, forward. The force began to move again. Not easily, not quickly, but they moved, the courage of conviction overriding the body's sensible objections, and the siege equipment was being manually forced forward through seized joints and iced ground, and the second wave on the ridge road was quickening its pace in response to the commander's voice. Elira pushed harder. This was the threshold. She felt it, not an abstract awareness but a physical sensation, as though something inside her was arriving at the edge of a cliff it had been walking toward for a long time. The second nature fully present, fully awake, fully at the surface. The power not in fragments, but whole, asking to be used whole. She felt the bond change, not break, not weaken, but change, becoming something more active, more urgent, the wolf instinct in Ronan pushing back against her approaching threshold with a force that was not suppression but counterbalance, the way two equal weights on a scale hold each other level. She could feel him beside her, not just physically, not just the warmth of his proximity, but the full quality of his presence, the wolf nature and the human nature and the 30 years of a man who had built himself into something immovable. She drew on that, not taking it, drawing on it the way you draw on solid ground, using its stability to support your own, using its weight as the reference point for your balance. The power came. Not the fragment that had frozen one man in a wedding hall, not the controlled demonstrations of the practice room. The full force directed, the second nature operating at capacity. And cold, and light. And the silver distortion above the approach became a visible thing, a dome of altered air that extended 50 yards out from the wall, and within which the temperature fell to a level that was not survivable for extended exposure without shelter. The advance force stopped, completely this time. Not even the commander moved. He was caught mid-attempt at a forward step, his breath coming in desperate visible clouds, his armor covered in a thin rime of frost that was building toward something less survivable by the second. The siege equipment was frozen solid. The approach, from the wall outward, was a landscape of ice and cold, and the silver air that caught the dawn light in ways that had no equivalent in any natural weather Northfall had seen in recorded history. Alira was shaking. She could feel the threshold, the restructuring Senna's mother had written about, the irreversible change the accounts described. It was right there. The power had found its full extent, and the body was at the edge of what it could hold in its current form. "Ronan," she said. Her voice did not sound like her usual voice. "I'm here," he said immediately. "It's—" She stopped. The shaking was not fear. It was the physical expression of something enormous being held at the edge of its own capacity. "It's at the threshold, the restructuring. I know." His hand closed around hers. The bond went from counterbalance to something more direct. Warmth flooding through the cold, the wolf nature pressing against the threshold alongside her, not blocking it but holding it, holding the edge so she didn't fall over it alone. The shaking slowed, the power held at the threshold without crossing it. The approach stayed frozen. Below, the lords were very quiet. The garrison was very quiet. Senna's pen had stopped moving in her notebook. The morning light was full now, hard and gold and northern, falling on a courtyard full of people who were watching the north battlement and the woman standing on it with her hand raised and frost in her hair and the air around her doing things that air was not supposed to do. And then Davin spoke. He was below, in the courtyard, and his voice carried in the morning quiet with the clarity of mountain air that doesn't absorb sound. "She's going to bring the wall down," he said. Not shouting, not accusing, almost wondering. The cold, the structural integrity of the stone at that temperature. She's going to bring the wall down on her own defense. Ronan looked at the wall. He looked at the frost creeping down the inside face of the north battlement stones, the thin creak of expanding ice in the mortar joints. Davin was right. The temperature Alira was maintaining on the approach, lethal to soldiers in the open, was also, at this sustained level, beginning to work on the 1,000-year-old stone beneath their feet. "Alira, Ronan said, you need to pull back." "If I pull back, they advance," she said. Still that voice, the voice of someone operating at the outer edge of everything they have. "I know, pull back to the threshold, just enough." He could feel the bond, feel where she was, feel the specific quality of holding at maximum that was fracturing the wall they were standing on. 30%, just 30%. I have you," he said. "Pull back." She pulled back. The temperature on the approach rose slightly, only slightly, from lethal to merely crippling, and the ice on the inner wall stopped spreading. The creaking in the mortar went quiet. The advance force still could not move. The siege equipment was still frozen, but the wall was no longer eating itself. Ronan released a breath he had been holding for some time. And then the second twist of the morning arrived,
in the form of a rider coming through the inner gate at full gallop, reining in so hard the horse's hindquarters nearly went down on the courtyard stones. The rider dropping from the saddle and running toward the lords with a message in his hand, and the expression of someone carrying information that had broken through their composure entirely. "The Southeastern Army!" the rider shouted, his voice cracking. "It stopped, my lord, the Southeastern force. It stopped moving. They've turned back." He was breathing too fast, trying to find the shape of the words. There are reports from the pass of something happened in the night. 3 of their commanders are dead. Their supply train is destroyed." He looked up at the battlement. He looked at Elira. "Their rear guard is reporting a woman in the Highland Pass walking toward them, generating—" He stopped. He looked again at the north battlement. The description matches. The courtyard went very still. Ronan turned to look at Elira. She had lowered her hands. Her face was pale, the effort of the morning visible in every line of it. But her expression was confused, genuinely confused, the look of someone hearing news that does not fit their understanding of their own situation. "I've been here," she said. "I haven't left the keep since I arrived." "I know," Ronan said. "Then who—" She stopped. From below, Theron's voice, very carefully. "If there is another one." The sentence hung in the morning air, incomplete and enormous. "Another Starborn," Brennan said, from the east wall, where he had apparently been listening to all of it. His voice carried the careful flatness of a man choosing his words with precision, because the alternative is no words at all. "There's another Starborn in the pass." Elira looked at Ronan. In her expression was the specific combination of shock and recognition, the recognition of something that the evidence had been pointing toward for a long time, and that the mind had not permitted itself to reach because the destination was too large. "My sister," she said, very quietly. "Mira refused the arrangement. My father said she refused. He said she refused and chose a convent in the Eastern Territories." She stopped. "He said she was not—" She stopped again. "He said she was not like me." "He lied," Ronan said. Elira looked at the mountains, at the pass where the Southeastern Army had turned back, at the ridge road where the second hollowed force was still present, still armed, still a threat, but now with an unknown variable behind them that the intelligence had not accounted for, and that their commanders were, judging by the sudden absence of forward movement, busy reassessing. "She's been out there," Elira said, "in the Highlands, following the army, doing—" She looked at her own hands. The silver distortion was still faint around them, the power still present, still at the edge of the threshold. "She's been doing what I've been doing in here." "Except alone," Ronan said. "No bond, no anchor." Elira's face changed, the shock resolving into something else, the expression of someone for whom a piece of information has just transformed from abstract into immediate and personal and urgent. "She can't stay at that level without it," Elira said. "Senna's mother's notes. The unanchored Starborn at maximum capacity." "I know," Ronan said. "She'll cross the threshold without anyone to—" Elira stopped. She turned from the mountains and looked at Ronan with an expression that was making a decision visible in real time. "I have to go to her. The advance force is still frozen, and I can maintain that level without the wall damage if I'm not simultaneously managing a combat situation." She was already moving, already heading for the battlement stairs. "The Highland Pass. She's in the Highland Pass. If the Southeastern Army is retreating, the pass is—" "Elira." He caught her arm. She stopped. He looked at her, at the full-awake second nature, at the woman 10 days married, at the person who had told him don't let go the night before in a practice room full of frozen lamps. "You just held an occupation force at maximum capacity for 20 minutes. I know. You're at the edge of the threshold. I know that too." She held his gaze. "She's my sister." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the bond, the way it had functioned as counterbalance, as anchor, as magnetic north. He thought about what Elira had described, the second nature answering the demand, finding, with some surprise, that it knew how to exist fully. He thought about a woman alone in a Highland Pass with no anchor, at the edge of an irreversible threshold. "I'm coming with you," he said. She looked at him, not surprised. She had stopped being surprised by this, he thought, and that itself was a kind of progress. Just looked at him with those deep water eyes and nodded. Below them, the advance force remained frozen. The lords remained watching. The morning remained cold and gold and absolutely certain of itself, the way mountain mornings always were, indifferent to the consequences of what had just been decided. Brennan appeared at the base of the stairs. He looked at Ronan's face. He looked at Elira. He said, with the resignation of a man who has spent 15 years watching his Alpha King make decisions that were strategically inadvisable and consistently necessary, "I'll hold the keep." "You'll hold the keep," Ronan confirmed, "and if the advance force thaws before you get back, then Theron's reserve arrives in an hour, and you have 4 lords and a garrison," Ronan said. "You know what to do." Brennan looked at them both for a moment. Then he stood aside. They went through the inner gate, into the cold and the mountains and the morning, moving toward the Highland Pass and the woman somewhere in it who was burning at the edge of everything she was, alone, unanchored, and running out of time. Behind them, Northfall held its breath. The Highland Pass was 3 miles from Northfall's outer gate, up a road that stopped being a road after the first mile and became instead a suggestion, a worn line through rock and ice and scrub, the kind of path that existed because people had walked it for generations rather than because anyone had built it. In summer it was navigable on horseback. In Frostmonth, with the season's ice having had weeks to establish itself in the crevices and angles of the rock, it required attention and commitment and a willingness to accept that the terrain had opinions about your passage that it would express without apology. Ronan and Elira moved through it at speed, not reckless speed. The speed of 2 people who understood the terrain's conditions and were moving at the maximum that those conditions permitted, which was faster than it looked from the outside because both of them had stopped negotiating with difficulty some time ago. Ronan had been moving through winter mountain terrain since childhood. Elira, in the days since the second nature had finished waking, had developed a relationship with cold that was less adversarial and more collaborative. She didn't fight the ice on the path, she read it, her feet finding purchase in ways that looked instinctive because they were. They didn't speak much on the climb. The bond was doing the communicating that words would have taken longer for. The quality of Ronan's alertness, scanning the ridgelines above. The quality of Elira's focus, oriented forward and upward, following something she could feel pulling her like a compass needle. "You can feel her," Ronan said. Not a question. "Since we left the gate," Elira said. "Faint, like feeling a fire through a wall. Not the heat exactly, but the fact of it." She paused. "She's still active, still at the threshold." Another pause. "She's been there for hours, since before dawn." Ronan did the arithmetic on that. Hours at the threshold, unanchored. The accounts in Senna's mother's notes had described the unanchored starborn at full capacity as a situation that resolved in one of 2 ways. Controlled depletion, which required the starborn to voluntarily draw back from the threshold, which was nearly impossible to achieve alone under combat pressure, or crossing. The irreversible restructuring, the change that the accounts described as survivable only in theory, because in practice there were no recorded instances of an unanchored starborn crossing the threshold and remaining themselves afterward. What remained afterward, the accounts suggested, was something that had been a person. "How far?" he said. "Close," she said. "The next bend? Maybe 2. They moved faster. The pass bent twice more and then opened into a wider space. Not quite a clearing, more an interruption in the rock walls where the mountain had pulled back to create a natural amphitheater perhaps 40 yards across. Snow-covered, high-walled, the sky a narrow strip of pale blue above it. And in the center of it, Mira. Elira stopped so suddenly that Ronan had to catch her arm to prevent her momentum from carrying her forward. He understood why she stopped. The woman in the center of the clearing was recognizable as Elira's sister in the way that a fire is recognizable as the same species as a candle. Same height, same sharp features, same pale coloring. But where Elira had spent 12 years learning to contain the second nature, this woman had spent those same years in a different kind of education entirely. Or perhaps no education at all. Perhaps simply survival.
alone in the highlands with a power that had no reference point and no instruction and no anchor, building itself to a level that had nowhere to go but outward. She was in the center of a circle of absolute winter. Not the contained, directed cold that Alira had deployed from the battlement, something raw, older, without the architecture of control around it. The snow within 20 feet of her was compressed to ice so dense it had gone blue. The rock walls of the natural amphitheater were sheeted with frost several inches thick. Her hands were raised at her sides, not in the focused posture of someone directing power, but in the involuntary posture of someone who cannot put it down, the power holding her up as much as she was holding it. Her eyes were open and luminous, and looking at something that was not the pass or the rock or the sky. The three dead hollowed commanders were at the edge of the clearing, frozen in their positions, mid-action, the way the assassin in the wedding hall had been frozen. But these three had not been given the wedding hall's precision. They had been caught at range, in the full output of an uncontrolled starborn, and what remained of them was not men, but sculptures of what men had been. "Mira," Alira said. Her voice was very careful. "The way you speak to someone who is standing at the edge of something, conscious that sound itself can change the physics." No response. "She can't hear you," Ronan said quietly. "I know what she is," Alira said. She knew because she could feel it through whatever the connection between two starborn of the same blood was. Not the same as the bond, not the alpha wolf calibration, but something older and more organic. She could feel Mira at the threshold, past the place where voluntary withdrawal was possible, past the place where Mira as an identity with choices and memory was fully in charge of the situation. The power had taken the wheel. Alira took a step forward. Ronan caught her arm. "The output," he said, "at 20 feet, that temperature, doesn't affect me the same way," she said. She looked at him. "Cold is not my threat. You know that." He looked at her for a moment. He did know that. What he also knew was that whatever was radiating from Mira's uncontrolled power was not simply temperature. It was the same quality as Alira's second nature, but without the container, without the structure, the thing in its raw form. And what the raw form would do to another starborn in proximity, when neither of them had a precedent in any text he'd read, was something he could not calculate. "If it destabilizes you," he said, "if being near her pushes you toward the threshold, then you hold me," she said. The same words as the night before. "That's what you're here for." He let go of her arm. She walked forward into the circle of absolute winter. The cold was real. Even for Alira, even with the second nature fully awake, the temperature in that 20-foot radius was a physical pressure, something that pushed at the body's edges and required the power to actively manage rather than simply existing. She managed it. It was work, but it was manageable work, the kind that left her hands free and her attention free for the thing that mattered. She stopped 5 feet from Mira. Up close, Mira's face was exhausted in a way that had gone past the point where exhaustion showed in normal ways. Not pale, the pallor past which a face stops looking like a face and starts looking like a surface. Her eyes, luminous and open, had the unfocused quality of someone in a high fever, seeing something, but not the clearing and not Alira. "Mira," Alira said again. Closer now. Different register. Not the careful approach voice, but the voice of someone who knows the person they're talking to. A flicker. Something in Mira's eyes that was not the raw power. Emotion. A reaching. Like watching something living move under ice. "I know you're in there," Alira said. "I know what this feels like. The power holding the shape of you while the real you is trying to find the surface." She paused. "I know because I've been at the edge of this for 8 days, and I kept finding the surface because of him." She didn't gesture toward Ronan. She didn't need to. Mira couldn't see him anyway. "But I found it, and you can find it." Nothing. "Mira." Alira took another step, 3 feet now. The cold pressing harder, the raw power in the air between them doing what it had done all morning, asking her own power to respond, to match it. The resonance of two starborn in proximity pulling both their natures toward the same frequency. She could feel the threshold move closer. "Father said you refused the arrangement because you didn't want to marry a northern lord." She paused.
He didn't tell me the real reason. He should have. She paused again. I'm sorry he didn't. I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry you've been out here alone. The air in the clearing changed, almost imperceptibly. The quality of the cold shifted, not warming, not weakening, but the absolute directionless output of uncontrolled power gaining the faintest suggestion of direction, as though something inside Mira had heard the word alone and reacted to it. Elira reached out her hand, not to touch, just to offer. Come back, she said. Mira's eyes moved, slowly, the unfocused luminescence adjusting the way a lens adjusts until the focal point was Elira, her sister's face, here, in this clearing, in this impossible morning. Her lips moved, no sound. I'm here, Elira said. I have you. And then Ronan, from the edge of the clearing, felt the bond go critical. Not Elira crossing the threshold, her, Mira. The proximity of her sister's voice, the offered hand, the word alone, something cracked in the structure of Mira's uncontrolled state. And the crack was not a weakness in the power, but a weakness in the thing that had been holding the power at bay from the real Mira. And through the crack, the real Mira came rushing back all at once. And the power, suddenly reconnected to a person with a will and a grief and a 12-year accumulation of alone, surged. The clearing went white. Not a flash, a sustained total white. The light that comes from cold the way heat produces light. The starborn power in its full expression without any container, both sisters in proximity, one controlled and one not. The resonance between them amplifying rather than canceling. Ronan moved. He crossed the 20 feet in the time it took the white light to reach the far rock walls. And the cold hit him like a wall and he pushed through it because there was no alternative. And he reached Elira's side and put his hand on her shoulder and the bond opened like a door. He had felt the bond before. In the practice sessions, in the council, in the moments of crisis. He had felt it as warmth, as counterbalance, as magnetic north. He had felt it as presence. He had not felt it like this, like standing in the center of a lightning strike and being the thing the lightning was looking for. The starborn power was in the air around him, between the sisters, resonating, and the wolf nature in his blood, the ancient force that his line had carried for generations. The thing that had stirred when Elira's veil fell in the wedding hall rose to meet it, not to fight it, not to suppress it, to answer it, the way Elira had described the second nature answering her demand. I knew how to do this. I always knew. The wolf nature moved through the bond into Elira, and through Elira's proximity into the space between the sisters, and it functioned as what it was, an anchor, a fixed point in the white, the thing that told the power where the edge was. Mira screamed, not in pain, in the specific, raw, full-body release of someone coming back to themselves after being very far away. A sound that started as a scream and became something else, something that required the full capacity of a human throat and then exceeded it, the power going out in one enormous, directed, fully conscious pulse that was the last of its uncontrolled expression before Mira's will came back online and caught it. The white went out. The clearing was just a clearing again, snow and rock and frost and the pale blue strip of sky above. 3 frozen commanders. The blue compacted snow. 2 women standing 3 feet apart, one with her hand still extended and one with both hands now pressed to her own chest, breathing in huge, ragged pulls. Ronan was on one knee. He didn't remember going to one knee. The cold and the bond and the power pulse had taken something out of him that would need time to come back, and for the moment his body had made a reasonable executive decision about his relationship with vertical. Mira, Elira said. Her voice was not perfectly steady. Neither were her hands, the extended one dropping now to her side, both of them shaking with the fine tremor of effort at its limit. Are you? Mira looked at her. Her eyes were her own again. The same shape as Elira's, but different in color, darker, with the look of someone who has just traveled a very long distance very quickly and is still processing the arrival. You're real, Mira said. Her voice was destroyed. Hours of screaming at a power she couldn't control had taken the top off it, left it rough and raw. Yes, Elira said. Father said. Mira stopped. She looked at Ronan,
on his knee in the snow, then back at Elira. He said the arrangement was to protect you. He said placing you in the north would put you beyond the Hollowed's reach. She paused. He didn't tell me he was sending you into a territory whose laws had historically... He was wrong about more than one thing, Elira said. We'll talk about father later. Right now I need to know if you're hurt. Mira looked at her hands. The power was still present. Elira could feel it. Both of them could feel it. The resonance quieter now, but not gone. But it was contained. Rough containment, without the 12 years of practice Elira had, without the bond's architecture, but hers, present behind her eyes rather than in front of them. I'm not hurt, Mira said. She looked at the frozen commanders, at the cleared hillside below the pass where the Southeastern Army had been. I think I've been, I don't know how long, since before dawn, Elira said. It started when they moved through the pass, Mira said. I was following them. I've been following the army for 3 days, keeping to the highland routes, trying to... She stopped. I didn't have a plan. I knew you were in Northfall. I knew the army was moving toward you. I thought if I could slow them... She paused. And then they went through the pass, and they were going to reach you, and I stopped thinking clearly. I know, Elira said. It got very large very fast, Mira said. She said it with the specific understatement of someone describing a dam break as some water. Yes, Elira said. I know that too. Ronan had gotten back to his feet. He was brushing snow off his knee and assessing the physical damage. Cold burns on his hands where the concentrated winter had gotten through his gloves. The deep fatigue in his chest where the bond had moved energy it wasn't used to moving. A ringing in his ears that he suspected was the after effect of the power pulse at close range. All of it manageable. All of it, compared to the alternative, a very favorable accounting. Mira was looking at him with the wariness of someone encountering a large northern lord in a mountain pass under circumstances that had not permitted a normal introduction. This is Ronan, Elira said. The Alpha King, Mira said. Not a question. She had done her research too, apparently. You're bonded. Yes, Elira said. And it works, Mira said. She was looking at the clearing, at the containment that had come back, at the absence of white light, at the evidence that something had stabilized what she hadn't been able to stabilize alone. The calibration. It actually works. It does, Elira said. And we have to go back because your work this morning has given us a window and I don't know how long it holds. She looked at her sister. Can you walk? Mira straightened. The motion of someone reclaiming their vertical out of pride rather than energy, but effective. Yes, she said. I can walk. She paused. The Southeastern commanders who are still alive, the ones I didn't... She glanced at the edge of the clearing. They retreated. I don't know how far. Far enough, Ronan said, his first words since entering the clearing. Both sisters looked at him. The army's broken formation. Without their commanders giving the advance order, a cult force doesn't self-organize well. They'll regroup, but it buys hours. He looked at Mira. How many were in the force you neutralized? 300, she said. Then, at whatever showed in his expression, The commanders were at the front. The rest scattered when the power... She stopped. I didn't kill 300 men. I know, he said. He had seen cult forces break before, at the sight of something outside their doctrine, the specific panic of a force that runs on certainty, encountering radical uncertainty. 300 soldiers scattering in a highland pass, in winter, without commanders, was a serious logistical problem for the Hollowed, and not something the Northern Coalition needed to solve today. He began moving toward the pass exit. Elira fell in beside him. After a moment, Mira followed. They moved in silence for a while, the descent requiring attention, and the silence having a quality that was not uncomfortable. 3 people who had just been through something large together and were still inside the largeness of it. Then Mira said from behind them, The bond. You weren't supposed to be able to feel it from that distance. Apparently I was, Ronan said. The texts say the alpha's reach through the bond is limited to immediate proximity. She was speaking with the focused interest of someone for whom academic engagement was a coping mechanism, which Ronan recognized as a family trait.
What you did in the clearing, extending it to reach me through Elira, that's not documented. A lot of things that happened this morning aren't documented, Ronan said. Senna will be pleased, Elira said, and Mira looked at her questioningly, and Elira said, I'll explain when we're somewhere warm, and they kept moving. They came back through the outer gate 50 minutes after they had left it. The north approach was still frozen. The advance force had not dispersed. They had retreated from their forward positions to the tree line, the intelligent thing to do when your soldiers can't advance without losing fingers. But they were still present and organized, waiting. The second hollowed force on the ridge road had stopped moving. The courtyard was different from when they had left it. Not in its military disposition. Archers were still on the battlements. The garrison was still deployed. The Lord's forces still held their positions. But the quality of the watching had changed. Ronan could see it as they came through the gate. The specific recalibration of a group of people who have spent an hour observing something that contradicts their existing framework and are in the process of revising. They had watched Elira freeze an advance force from the battlement. They had watched her hold that freeze for 20 minutes while the wall moved under their feet. They had watched Ronan take her hand and steady the situation. They had then watched the two of them walk out of the gate toward the highlands and stood here, for an hour, with the north approach frozen and the ridge road force stalled and the intelligence about the southeastern army, and they had thought about it. Brennan was the first to reach them. He looked at Mira with an expression that processed her presence with the focused neutrality of someone who had made peace with the category of unexpected additional developments long ago. The Highland force, he said to Ronan, disorganized. No immediate threat. The southeastern army broke formation. Mira took out the lead commanders. Brennan looked at Mira. Mira, he said, as though confirming the name. Her sister, Ronan said. She's staying. Brennan absorbed this. Of course she is, he said, and turned to begin revising his deployment plans for the presence of a second starborn. He had the quality, Ronan had always appreciated, of a second-in-command who could integrate new information without requiring an emotional processing interval. The Lords came next. Not en masse. Pharaoh first because Pharaoh had moved through the morning with the practical orientation of a military mind rather than a political one, and he had been doing the math since dawn and had arrived at a conclusion he wanted to confirm. He stopped in front of Elira, looked at her, then at the frozen north approach, then back at her. The advance force, he said. You can maintain that. For several more hours, Elira said. Yes. And the temperature, can you modulate it? Bring it to a non-lethal threshold if they don't advance. She looked at him, reading the question underneath the question. Not can you harm, but can you choose not to harm? The question of control. The question that the council document had not been able to ask directly. Yes, she said. I can. Pharaoh was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, the specific nod of a military man updating his assessment. I want to talk to you about the ridge force, he said. The angle of approach from the highland, if the second force tries to come through while the eastern route is still... Later, Ronan said. Give us an hour. Pharaoh looked at him. The window you mentioned... I know. An hour. He met Pharaoh's eyes. The people who just stabilized your defensive situation need an hour. Pharaoh held his gaze for a moment. Then he stepped aside. Theron came next. He came differently than Pharaoh, more slowly, with the weight of a man carrying a specific acknowledgement that was taking effort to deliver. He stopped in front of Ronan. He did not, Ronan noted, look at Elira first. He looked at Ronan, and then he turned and looked at Elira, and his expression had the quality of something that had been arranged into a position it did not naturally occupy and was holding there by decision. The wall, he said, when the ice was in the mortar. You heard your husband's warning and you pulled back. Elira looked at him. Yes. You were at maximum capacity and you pulled back. Theron's voice was carefully even. That requires... He paused. That requires a degree of control that the accounts I've read do not attribute to the Starborn at that level. The accounts are wrong about several things, Elira said. She said it without heat. The bond changes the dynamic. It gives the power a reference point. I'm not at the mercy of it. I can make choices within it. Theron was quiet for a moment. He looked at the frozen approach. He looked at Mira, standing slightly behind Elira, and something in his face processed this additional data point and filed it.
2 of them, he said very quietly,
not to anyone specifically. Yes, Elira said. Another silence.
The annulment motion, Theron said, and then stopped. The sentence had been started with a heading and arrived somewhere different than he'd planned, and he rerouted. The annulment motion was a political instrument designed to prevent a risk I was assessing incorrectly. Ronan said nothing. The risk was not your wife, Theron said. He looked at Ronan now. The risk was the Hollowed, and the Hollowed are at our walls because of your wife's presence, but they would have come regardless. Sooner or later, they always come. He paused. Your wife is not the risk. She's the only reason the north approach is frozen and the ridge force hasn't advanced. Yes, Ronan said, simply. Theron looked back at Elira. Something in his expression that was not apology, soit. He was not a man who apologized, not readily, not structurally, but was the thing that preceded the conditions under which an apology might eventually become possible. The East Wall Reserve will be here within the hour, he said. My men are yours to deploy as needed. He paused. Alpha Queen. He turned and left. Elira stood very still for a moment after he'd gone. Then she said to Ronan very quietly, He called me Alpha Queen. Yes, Ronan said. He called me the wrong thing every way he possibly could for 10 days, and then he called me Alpha Queen. People revise, Ronan said, when the evidence is sufficient. She looked at him, something in her expression that was not quite amusement but lived in the same neighborhood. You could say I told you so. I could, he said. I'm not going to. That's probably wise, she said. Mira, who had been observing all of this from a few feet back, said, Is it always like this? Like what? Elira said. Like him. Mira gestured at Ronan with the economy of someone whose vocabulary for the situation is still forming. The way he just handles things. Yes, Elira said. A pause. I've noticed. Ronan began moving toward the main keep entrance. Eat something, he said over his shoulder. Both of you. And Yael will want to examine Mira before we discuss the afternoon's deployment. Mira looked at Elira. Does he always give orders like that? Like he's concluding an argument that was never actually held? Always, Elira said. And the almost smile was present and full this time, not at the edge of her composure, but through it, the real thing. You get used to it. Davin came to find Ronan an hour later. He found him in the war room alone, reviewing the updated deployment maps that accounted for Mira's presence and Elira's sustained hold on the north approach and Theron's redirected reserve. The morning had produced a tactical situation that was not victory. The Hollowed forces were still present, still organized at a distance, still a threat that required resolution rather than simply a frozen approach. But the nature of the situation had shifted in the essential way. They were no longer being outmaneuvered. They had time, and time was what the morning had been unable to offer. Davin came in and closed the door behind him. He sat in the chair across the table without being invited, which was his right and his habit, and he looked at Ronan with the expression of someone who had something to say and had been composing it for an hour. The Highland woman is Elira's sister, he said. Yes, Ronan said. Another starborn. Yes. Davin was quiet for a moment. The family concealed it, he said, from everyone, including you. Yes. And House Voss's plan was to place both daughters in situations that provided external stability, bonds, alliances, to anchor a power that they either couldn't or wouldn't manage themselves. He paused. The elder one was sent into the Highlands alone. The younger one was sent to you. He paused again. Your wife is the responsible deployment. I hadn't framed it that way, Ronan said. I'm framing it for both of us, Davin said. He looked at the map, at the positions of the Hollowed forces frozen in their approach, at the territory they had failed to cover, the passes they had abandoned to the night movement, The gap in the plan that had been filled by a woman alone in the mountains, doing something no one had planned for and everyone had benefited from. "I was wrong," Davin said. Ronan looked at him. "Not about the risk," Davin said. "There was a real risk. The Whitecrest history, the structural concerns about the power without an anchor, those weren't fabricated. The Coalition's concerns were not fabricated." He paused. "But the conclusion I drew from the risk was wrong. I assumed the risk was the Starborn." He looked at the map. "The risk was always the Hollowed. We've been fighting the wrong battle." "You've been fighting the battle you could see," Ronan said. "People do that. That's charitable." "It's accurate," Ronan said. "The intelligence about the Army's scale wasn't available when you drafted the Coalition document. You were working with what you had." He paused. "What I needed from you was a revision when new information came in. You've revised." Davin looked at him. "That's—" He stopped. "Most people would hold the initial position against me longer." "I don't have the time," Ronan said simply. "And neither do you." Davin was quiet for a moment. Then he reached forward and turned the map slightly, orienting it toward himself, and began looking at the Ridge Road position with the focused attention of a man who had moved from opponent to contributor. "The Ridge Force," he said. "They haven't committed since the southeastern route collapsed. That's not indecision. That's a commander holding the secondary option while they assess the new situation." He pointed to the Highland approach. "If they move through this draw in the dark, they come out here, behind the East Wall Reserve's position." "I know," Ronan said. "I've been looking at it." "You need someone in the Highland approach before the reserve arrives," Davin said. "Your garrison is committed to the walls." He paused. "My personal force came in through the East Pass 3 days ago. They're rested. I have 40 men. Ronan looked at him, at the man who had called for the annulment, who had been the Coalition's constitutional anchor, who had just spent an hour watching the morning revise everything he'd thought he understood and had chosen, with the directness that had always been his best quality under the political calculation, to revise with it. "Take the Highland approach," Ronan said. "Hold it until the reserve arrives. After that, you have discretion." "Yes," Davin said. He stood, looked at the map one more time, and then looked at Ronan. For what it's worth, she handled Theron better than I would have. "Yes," Ronan agreed. The way she answered him, not defensive, just accurate. He paused at the door. "She's going to be a problem for every lord who still thinks this is a manageable situation." "Good," Ronan said. Davin almost smiled. Then he left. The afternoon session with the forces took 3 hours and produced a defensive arrangement that accounted for the Hollowed's remaining options in a way the morning's plan had not. Davin's 40 men moved to the Highland approach. The East Wall Reserve arrived at the second hour and was integrated into the North Wall's defense. Pharaoh took command of the eastern flank with the focus of a man who had been wanting a clear operational role since the First Council and was making productive use of it. Mira, after Yael's examination, which the physician conducted with the same professional thoroughness and the same carefully neutral expression she brought to all unprecedented medical situations, was installed in the practice room with Senna, who had organized herself and her notebook for the documentation of a second Starborn with an efficiency that suggested she had been half expecting this development. Illyra maintained the north approach through the afternoon, modulating the temperature as Pharaoh had asked. Not lethal, but uncomfortable enough that the advance forces commanders chose to hold position rather than test it. Ronan stayed on the north battlement for most of the afternoon, not because Illyra needed supervision, but because the bond functioned better at proximity, and proximity was also useful for military coordination, and he had stopped requiring his reasons to be entirely professional. At the third hour, the north approach force withdrew. Not a rout. An organized, deliberate withdrawal, the kind that communicated this position is no longer viable, rather than we are defeated. The advance force pulled back in formation, taking their frozen jointed siege equipment with them, and moved to regroup with the Ridge Road force. Illyra lowered her hands when they were beyond range. She was standing at the battlement in the late afternoon light, the golden northern light that made everything look more decided than it was, and her hands came down and stayed at her sides, and she stood very still for a moment that was not the practiced stillness of management, but something else.
something she was feeling rather than performing. "They're going to come back," she said. "Yes," Ronan said. "The main body is still intact. They'll reassess and try a different approach." "We have hours, not days," she said. "Yes, but hours are more than we had this morning." She turned and looked at him. The afternoon light was doing things to her face that were more complicated than beauty. It was showing the cost of the day, the exhaustion underneath the second nature's sustained activity, the weight of what the morning had required and what the afternoon had required and what tomorrow was going to require. All of it visible. And beneath all of it, the thing that had been building since a wedding hall full of flowers and violence. The thing that was neither the second nature nor the bond's architecture, but simply her, Illyra Voss, finding her way to being fully herself in the most hostile possible conditions, and discovering that fully herself was, in fact, enough. "My sister is alive," she said. "Yes." "She's in the practice room with Sina, and they're probably already rewriting the historical record." "Almost certainly," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the courtyard was reorganizing into its evening configuration. Guards changing, supply lines moving, the efficient human architecture of a defended position settling into its overnight rhythms. In the corridor behind the battlement, Ronan could hear Theron's voice, giving orders to his reserve commanders in the tone of a man who had chosen a position and was holding it. "Theron called me Alpha Queen," Illyra said. "He did." He was the one who wrote abomination in the first message. "He revised," Ronan said. She looked at him. The almost smile, and then more than almost. The real thing, full and present, no composure between it and the world. "You keep saying that," she said. "People revise, people revise." "Because it's true," he said, "and because it's the thing worth waiting for." She looked at him for a long moment, and the bond between them was quiet, in the way things are quiet when they're not absent but settled. The current still there, still warm, but unhurried. The wolf and the star, calibrated. "I need to eat something," she said, "and sleep for approximately 100 years. "You have until dawn," he said. She turned toward the battlement stairs, then stopped, turned back, looked at him with an expression that was doing something new, something that was not managed, not composed, not at the edge of something being held back, just present, just her. "Thank you," she said. "For the clearing, for coming." "You would have reached her," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but I wouldn't have held." A pause. "You know that." He did know that. He looked at her across the battlement in the failing light, the mountains enormous and indifferent behind her, and he thought about a woman standing in a courtyard 9 days ago, learning not to brace for the harder answer. "Go eat," he said. She went. Below, the north approach was empty. The ice she had built, over hours of sustained focus, remained, holding the ground, holding the space, keeping the shape of what she had chosen to do with what she was. The evening cold moved over it without changing it. Ronan stood on the battlement and watched the light go out of the mountains. And in the courtyard below him, the keep moved and breathed and held itself together. And somewhere in the practice room, 2 sisters were speaking to each other for the first time in years. And in the war room, Davin's report was being drafted, and in the eastern corridor, Theron's voice was still giving orders, and all of it, was still standing. For now, just for now. But now was more than nothing. The Hollowed came back before dawn. Not hours. 2. 2 hours after the north approach emptied, while Northfall was still in the compressed urgency of its evening reorganization, and the East Wall Reserve was still finding its positions, and Illyra was sitting in the kitchen off the main corridor eating bread and dried meat with the focused economy of someone fueling a machine that had more work ahead of it. The warning bell rang at the 2nd hour past midnight. Ronan was awake. He had not slept. He had intended to. He had gone to the Alpha's quarters and lain down with that intention fully formed, and for approximately 40 minutes he had existed in the shallow territory between waking and sleep, where the mind does its most honest accounting. The accounting had not produced rest. It had produced clarity, which was a different thing, and he had been sitting at the narrow desk by the window reviewing the deployment charts when the bell rang and saved him the pretense. He was on the battlement in 4 minutes. What the bell had seen The hollowed had consolidated, the advance force that had withdrawn at the third hour, the ridge road force that had been holding its position, and a third element that intelligence had not fully accounted for. A reserve that had come down through the western pass in the night, smaller than the others but carrying equipment that the moonlight made visible in the worst possible way. Siege ladders. Grappling equipment. The tools of a force that was no longer interested in a slow frontal approach and had decided that speed and simultaneous pressure from multiple angles was the answer to a problem that had resisted resolution all day. 3 directions. The north approach, the eastern flank, and the western wall where the reserve had come out of the pass. Brennan was at his right shoulder before he'd finished reading the approach. Farrow is moving to the east. Davin's force is still in the Highland approach. They'll intercept the western reserve if they move quickly. Get a runner to Davin, Ronan said. He needs to be moving now. He looked at the north approach. The ice was still there, still holding. He could see it in the moonlight, the faint blue-white gleam of Alira's sustained work. But the advance force had gone around it, was pressing toward the wall sections on either side of the frozen corridor. They learned from this morning, Brennan said. Yes, Ronan said. They're not walking into the freeze again. They're going around it. Then the freeze is no longer the defensive barrier. No, Ronan said. It's the center of a line that's about to be flanked from both sides. He thought for 3 seconds. Get everyone off the north approach wall sections. Pull them to the towers. That concedes the... Get them off, Ronan said. Now. Brennan went. Alira arrived at the battlement 60 seconds later. She had her hair pulled back, her coat on, and the expression of someone who had not been asleep and had heard the bell with the readiness of a person waiting for it. She looked at the approach. Read it the same way he had. They went around it, she said. Yes. She looked at the frozen corridor. The ice she had spent the afternoon building, the sustained work of hours, now rendered tactically obsolete by a commander who had studied the morning's engagement and drawn the correct lesson from it. The freeze is useless, she said, not bitterly, just the fact. The freeze held us through the afternoon, Ronan said. It bought Theron's reserve, Davin's position, the regrouping. It did its job. He looked at her. What I need now is different. She looked at the 3-direction approach. At the moonlit movement of the consolidated hollowed force, organized and resolute, the conviction of men who had been hunting the starborn for 3 generations and believed that tonight was the night the hunt ended. I can't hold 3 approaches simultaneously, she said. Not at the level I was holding this afternoon. Not from up here. She paused. The range, the dispersal. I'd have to be closer to each approach to direct it precisely enough, and I can't be in 3 places. No, Ronan said. You can't. A silence. The moonlight. The approaching force. But I don't have to direct it precisely, she said slowly. He looked at her. This afternoon, the north approach, I was being precise. Temperature, distance, control. Not killing, not breaking the wall, directed output. She was looking at the field below the walls, the full extent of it, the area between the outer defenses and the positions the hollowed were moving toward. If I'm not trying to be precise, the wall, he said. The structural damage. I'm not on the wall, she said. If I'm out there, no, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the expression that had 2 layers, the tactical and the other thing, the thing that was not tactical at all, both of them present simultaneously. Ronan, she said. Not alone, he said. It's not alone, he said again, same tone. The tone that was not an order because he didn't give her orders, but was something that functioned like an order because it came from the same place orders came from, the place where what mattered had been decided before the conversation started. Tell me what you need. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the field. Then at the sky, the dark, clear, star-dense sky of Northfall in Frost Month, the stars here so close and numerous they changed the character of the dark. The courtyard gate, she said. Open it. I go out to the center of the field. Not near any wall, not near any structure. She paused. And you stay in range of the bond. Within 50 feet, I need the anchor or I can't maintain the control at full output. 50 feet, he said. It'll be dangerous, she said. Yes, he said. When isn't it? Brennan's expression when Ronan told him the plan was a masterpiece of controlled response. A man absorbing information that violated his protective instincts on every level and choosing, in real time, to trust the larger calculus. The field, Brennan said. Between the walls and the advance force. Yes. Both of you. Yes. A pause. I'll want archers on every tower covering the approach, Brennan said. Not as an objection, as a modification. Full coverage. If anything gets within 30 feet of your position, done, Ronan said, and get Mira to the north battlement. Brennan's control slipped just slightly. She's recovered enough for a supporting position, Ronan said. She doesn't have Alira's control, but she doesn't need it from the battlement. She needs to be visible. He paused. They came here because they believe the Starborn is something they can hunt. I want them to see 2 of them and recalculate. Brennan looked at him for a long moment. You're not just trying to defend the walls, he said. You're trying to break their certainty. The Hollowed have been hunting the Starborn for 3 generations on the belief that the power is uncontrolled and destructive and that righteous force can extinguish it, Ronan said. Tonight I want to demonstrate that every piece of that belief is wrong. Not with a defensive action, with something they can't fit into their doctrine. Brennan was quiet. Then he said, The Lords are going to watch this. Yes, Ronan said. That's also the point. They opened the courtyard gate at the hour before dawn, in the dark, when the approaching force was 200 yards from the outer wall and moving with the focused, rehearsed momentum of a final assault. Ronan and Alira walked out together. No armor for her. Armor was irrelevant to what she was doing, and the weight would be a problem. She was in dark wool, coat open despite the cold, hands bare. Her hair was loose. She had taken it down in the courtyard, which was not a tactical decision, but which Ronan had watched without comment. The second nature was fully present. He could see it in the way the air around her moved, in the quality of her attention, in the fact that the frost on the ground 2 feet ahead of her was forming before she reached it. He was armed, sword at his hip, knife at his back, the formal weights of the weapons a kind of constant in the physics of how he moved. Not because he expected to fight, he expected the battle to be Alira's, as it was always going to be, but because standing in an open field between your keep and an advancing army with no weapon was a choice he was not wired to make. 50 feet behind her. That was the parameter. He measured it as they moved through the outer gate and onto the open ground, watching the distance establish itself. And then he stopped and she kept moving. 15 yards, 20, 25. And she stopped and turned back and looked at him over that 50 feet of cold, dark ground. And the bond was a clear, bright current between them, fully present, the wolf and the star finding their frequency the way they always did when the distance was right. She turned back toward the approach. The hollowed force was visible now, not the distant moonlit movement of before, but close enough to resolve into individuals. 160 in the northern approach, the remains of the force she'd frozen that afternoon, now reinforced with portions of the Ridge Road force. They had ladders. They had grappling lines. They were moving with the grim precision of a force that had made its calculation and committed. Their commanders were watching the 2 figures on the open field. Alira raised her hands. What happened next was not what happened that afternoon on the battlement. The afternoon had been directed, precise, controlled. A specific temperature, a specific area, power applied like a tool to a defined problem. What happened now was Alira Voss allowing the second nature to move into its full expression without the container of precision, without the constraint of targeted output, without the architectural management of a specific goal. She gave it room, the full awakening, the threshold she had been walking toward for 8 days, the restructuring that Senna's mother's notes had described, arrived not as a crisis, but as a decision. She walked into it the way you walk into cold water. One clear choice, one committed step, and then the physics of it took over. The field went white. Not the raw, uncontrolled white of Mira's crisis in the Highland clearing. Not the eruption of a power without an anchor. Something entirely different. Something that had a shape, had a direction, had the quality of an intelligence behind it. The light came from her hands and extended outward in a dome that covered the open field and reached the advancing force and went further, reached the outer wall and stopped there, precisely there, because she had chosen where it stopped. Inside the dome, winter transformed, not just cold. The temperature dropped below anything Northfall had experienced in recorded history, in the space of 3 heartbeats, but it dropped with the geometry of choice, a gradient, coldest at the force's leading edge, modulating back toward Elira's position, leaving Ronan in a band of cold that was survivable because she had decided it would be. The advance force stopped. Every soldier, every commander, every man who had spent years training for the hunt, building the conviction that the Starborn was a monster to be extinguished, carrying the 3-generation legacy of the Hollowed's absolute belief in its own righteous purpose, stopped. Because the thing in front of them was not what the doctrine had prepared them for. The doctrine said, the Starborn is a destroyer, a force of chaos that consumes itself and everything around it, a danger to be eliminated before the consumption spreads. The doctrine had been built on the accounts of unanchored Starborn at crisis, the moments of maximum terror, maximum eruption, the power at its worst. What stood in the field before them was not that. What stood in the field before them was a woman in dark wool with her hands raised and light around her that was not chaos. It was precise. It was aware. It was contained with an authority that the doctrine had never modeled because the doctrine had never imagined it was possible. And behind her, 50 feet back, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories stood in the snow and did not move and did not flinch and held, with the visible weight of his presence, the space that made all of it possible. The doctrine had no provision for this. On the north battlement, Mira raised her own hands. She was not at Elira's level, not the full awakening, not the 8 days of practice and the bond's anchor, but she was a Starborn who had spent 3 years in the Highlands surviving alone on power that had no reference point, and what she produced from the battlement was raw and visible and undeniable. A secondary cold, different in quality from Elira's, rougher, less geometric, but enormous, spreading from the battlement in a visible shimmer that the remaining approach forces saw and that the Ridge Road force saw from their elevated position, and that the lords and garrison and Theron's assembled reserve all saw. 2 Starborn, one controlled, one standing, both present, neither destroyed, neither consuming. The Hollowed commander, a different one from the morning's commander still thawing in his memories of the advance, stood in the field and looked at the light. He looked for a long time. Then he looked back at his force, at the men who had stopped, who were standing in the cold and the light, and not advancing, not because they had been ordered to stop, but because their bodies had made a determination that their doctrine had not prepared them to override. He raised his fist, the signal to hold. He turned back to the field. He looked at Elira. She was looking at him. She had been looking at him, Ronan could tell from 50 feet away, with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete, without pretense, reading what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. The commander did something that Ronan had not expected. He removed his helm. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the face of a man who had been absolutely certain about something for a very long time and was in the process of the most painful kind of revision. The revision not of fact, but of meaning. "Starborn," he said. His voice carried in the frozen air with a clarity that seemed wrong for the circumstances, too intimate for a battlefield. "You are not what we were told." Elira looked at him. "No," she said. "I'm not." A long silence. The cold, the light, the 50 feet of open ground between them and the 50 feet behind them and the walls of Northfall beyond that, and on the walls the lords and the garrison and Theron's reserve, all of them watching. "The Hollowed doctrine," the commander said. His voice had changed. The ritual certainty of a man invoking his cause, replaced by something more uncertain and more real. 3 generations of doctrine. We were told the Starborn were the destroyers of civilization, that the power was uncontainable, that the only... He stopped. He looked at the dome of light, the geometric precision of it, the temperature gradient that had stopped at the wall because she had chosen for it to stop. "We were told wrong." "Yes," Elira said. The commander stood in the cold field for a moment that stretched longer than moments usually did. Then he turned and said something to his second in a low voice, and the second turned and began moving back along the line. The force withdrew. Not a rout. Not the chaos of a force broken by superior firepower. Something more difficult and more complete. A force choosing to disengage because the premise of their engagement had been removed. They pulled back in order, taking their equipment, and they moved away from the walls with the specific quality of men who have a great deal of thinking to do and have decided to do it somewhere else. The Ridge Road force followed. Within 20 minutes of the dome going up, both forces were in withdrawal, and Davian's 40 men in the Highland approach had intercepted the Western Reserve and sent them back up the pass without engagement. The news of what was happening in the field had traveled faster than the reserve had been able to. Illyra lowered her hands. The dome came down. The light went out. She stood in the field in the dark and the cold, the ordinary cold, Northfall's usual cold, nothing more. And her hands dropped to her sides and she was shaking, the full-body tremor of someone who has held an enormous weight for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. Ronan covered the 50 feet in seconds. He got to her as her knees started to decide, and he caught her the way he caught things, with his full attention and his full weight behind it, braced and solid, not catching her so she didn't fall, but catching her so she didn't fall alone. "I've got you," he said. "I know," she said. Her voice was barely there. The dome had taken everything the second nature had, the full awakening operating at maximum capacity for, she didn't know how long. Long enough. "Did it?" "They're withdrawing," he said. "Both forces." A silence. She was breathing carefully, deliberately, the way you breathe when your body needs to remember how to do it on its own. "The restructuring," she said. "I crossed the threshold." "Yes," he said. "I'm still—" She paused. "I'm still me." "Yes," he said. "You are." She was quiet for a moment, leaning against him on the open field with the Northfall walls before them and the withdrawing force behind and the cold doing what the cold always did, continuing, regardless, permanent and indifferent and absolutely certain of its own existence. "Senna's mother was right," Illyra said. "About the bond." "Yes," Ronan said. "She was right about a lot of things," Illyra said. "I hope she knew that." He thought about a scholar whose notes had survived her by years, sitting in a library being read by the daughter who had kept them and the woman who needed them. "I think she did," he said. Illyra straightened, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone taking back their own weight from a borrowed structure, which she did without drama and without apology, because she had always been capable of standing alone. She just didn't have to anymore. She looked at the walls, at the battlements where Mira was visible, both hands lowered now, watching. At the courtyard where the lords and garrison and reserve were arranged in the particular stillness of people who have just watched something change the shape of what they believed. She looked for a long time. Then she walked back through the outer gate. The morning came the way Northfall mornings always came, without sentiment, without ceremony, the light arriving over the eastern ridge in the hard gold of early winter and laying itself across the snow and stone with complete indifference to what had happened in the dark. Ronan called the council at the first hour, all 9 lords. Present, seated, the round table without hierarchy, the circular room that had been built for exactly this kind of reckoning. Brennan at the wall. Yael in the corner, because Yael attended any significant gathering now as a matter of course, her leather notebook present as a reminder that everything was being documented. Illyra sat at the table. This was new. The first 2 councils she had not been invited to sit. This time Ronan had said, the night before, in the kitchen, eating bread, both of them exhausted past the pretense of protocol, "You'll sit at tomorrow's council," and she had said, "You don't have to make that a statement." And he had said, "It is a statement," and she had said, "All right," and had eaten the rest of her bread. She was there when the lords arrived. In the seat to Ronan's left, which was the Alpha Consort's seat by tradition, and also in a physical sense the seat from which the bond was most comfortable, which was a thing she had stopped pretending was not a factor. The lords seated themselves. Theron first, as had become his habit. The author of the coalition document, establishing the frame. Then Pharaoh. Then the others. Davin last, who had come back from the Highland approach at the 4th hour of the morning with 40 tired men and the specific satisfaction of a person who had been useful in a way that required revision of their prior position and had made the revision. He sat across from Elira. He looked at her directly, which was itself something different from the first council. Ronan let the room settle. Then he said, "The Hollowed have withdrawn from all 3 approaches. Their force cohesion is broken. The primary strategic threat to Northfall is resolved." He said nothing else. He let the room be a room. Theron spoke first. "The motion for annulment," he said. A pause. Several of the lords shifted slightly. "Is withdrawn," Theron continued, "unconditionally and without procedural qualification." He did not look at Elira when he said this, and then he did, and held her gaze for a moment that was its own kind of acknowledgement. "I authored the document. I withdraw it." Silence. "The grounds for withdrawal," Theron said, "are the following. The strategic value of the Alpha Queen's capabilities was demonstrated conclusively in last night's engagement. The control she exercised under maximum pressure was not the behavior of a power without governance. And the historical framework on which the coalition's concerns were based has been—" He paused. He was choosing his words with the care of a man who wanted to be accurate and also did not want to be understood as claiming he had been entirely wrong, which was a narrow path. "Materially revised by observation." More silence. "I'd like to say something," Pharaoh said. Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Elira. "The gradient," he said. "Last night, the temperature across the field, you stopped it at the wall. You had enough output to have frozen the inner courtyard, and you stopped it at the wall." "Yes," Elira said. "That was—" Pharaoh looked for the word and settled, with the practicality of a military man, on the accurate one. "That was the most precise, large-scale defensive action I have ever seen. I've commanded in 3 major engagements, and I have never seen a force held and released with that level of—" He stopped. "I'm saying I was wrong about the risk." Elira looked at him. "You were working with the information available to you," she said. "I was working with doctrine I hadn't examined," Pharaoh said. "There's a difference." One of the other lords, not Davin, not Theron, one of the 7 whose names Elira had learned in the days of political architecture, said quietly, "The Hollowed Commander. He spoke to you." "Yes," Elira said. "What did he say?" She told them. "You are not what we were told." The room was quiet in the specific way of people hearing a sentence that applies to themselves. "The doctrine," Davin said. He was looking at the table, then at Elira. 3 generations of Hollowed doctrine was built on accounts of unanchored starborn in crisis. No controlled observations. No bonded instances. He paused. "The academic record in the North is the same. Moss, the Third Era accounts, all crisis records. Nothing observed under controlled conditions." Another pause. "We built law and fear and a coalition motion on a record that was entirely composed of the worst-case scenario." "Yes," Elira said. "And the worst-case scenario," Davin said slowly, "wasn't the power. It was the isolation." He looked at Ronan. "A starborn without an anchor, without a bond, under attack." He paused. "That's not a monster. That's a person in an impossible situation with nowhere to go." The room absorbed this. Elira was very still. The word isolation had landed on something. She could feel it, the way Davin had not intended it to, but the word had found its truth anyway. In the 12 years she had spent containing the second nature alone, in Mira in the Highland clearing, in every unanchored starborn the historical record had described as a catastrophe without asking what had happened to them before the catastrophe. She looked at Ronan. He was watching the room, but the bond was fully present between them, and she understood through it that he had heard what she heard in Davin's sentence. "My sister," Elira said. The lords looked at her. "Mira has been in the Highlands for 3 years," she said, "unanchored, unrecorded, surviving alone. She stopped an army last night. She also nearly lost herself in a Highland pass, not because the power is ungovernable, but because she had no one to—" She stopped. She needs what I have, a bond, an anchor, and she needs it to be chosen, not assigned. She looked at Ronan. I need you to make it possible for her to find that here, not as a political asset, as a person. Ronan looked at her, then at the room. Mira Voss, he said, is a guest of the keep with the rights and protections that entails. Her status is under the Alpha Queen's authority, not the Council's. He paused. Unless anyone at this table has an objection to that framing, the table was quiet. No objections. Then this council is closed, Ronan said, and we have a keep to put back together. The days that followed had a different quality from anything that had come before them. Not easy. Nothing in Northfall was ever easy. The mountains saw to that, the weather saw to that, the 10-year accumulation of a border war's aftermath saw to that. But different. The thing that had been held in tension for the past 3 weeks, the trial by pressure of what Northfall could accommodate and what it would reject, had resolved itself not into a settlement exactly, but into a new arrangement of the furniture. The room was the same room. The people in it were the same people. But the furniture was in different places, and the light came in at different angles, and the shape of life inside it was not what it had been before a southern convoy of 19 carriages and 42 guards, and one woman had come through the outer gate. Mira was the most visible change. She emerged from the practice room on the second day after the battle with Sina at her side and a set of Northfall's library books under her arm, and the specific bearing of someone who has spent 3 years alone and is still figuring out what to do with walls and people and the presence of others. She was pricklier than Elira, less practiced in composure, more likely to say the accurate thing at the cost of the diplomatic thing. Yael began working with her immediately and with visible satisfaction, because Yael was the kind of physician who found unprecedented medical situations professionally invigorating rather than distressing. Elira watched her sister's adjustment with the focused, personal attention of someone who understood the specific texture of the experience. She did not hover. She gave Mira the room that room required and was present in the ways that presence was useful, and she did not try to compress the adjustment into a timeline that would have been more comfortable for everyone around it. Ronan watched Elira watch Mira and said nothing and understood everything. The lords departed over the course of a week, each leaving with the specific gravity of people carrying something new that they were still sorting out. Pharaoh left with a copy of Sina's mother's research, which Senna gave him without commentary, but with the expression of someone entrusting something important to a person she had decided to cautiously trust. Theron left with an agreement, negotiated over 2 days of careful conversation with Elira, who approached the negotiation with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to legal research, that the Eastern Territories would formally recognize the Alpha Queen status and the Starborn's legal standing under updated Northern law. Davin left last. He and Ronan stood in the courtyard on the final morning with the specific ease of 2 men who had been through a crucible together and had come out of it with their relationship restructured into something more honest, if not simpler. The constitutional challenge, Davin said. It won't come from me again. I know, Ronan said. I can't speak for others, Davin said. The North is large and memory is long. Yes, Ronan said, but memory revises, when the evidence is sufficient. Davin looked at him. You keep saying that. It keeps being true, Ronan said. Davin mounted his horse. He looked at the keep's entrance, where Elira was visible in the doorway, not watching them, attending to something else, but present in the way she was always present, the second nature giving her the quality of a room that has a fire in it, even when you're not looking directly at the fire. She's good for the North, Davin said, simply without political architecture around it. Yes, Ronan said. She is. Davin rode through the gate. Ronan watched him go. The formal recognition came at the end of the month. It was not a ceremony Ronan had planned. He had not, in the urgent days of the Hollowed's advance and the Council's revision, given thought to the architecture of official recognition. What it turned out to be was organic, which was appropriate for something that had spent 3 weeks demonstrating that the formal architecture was not the substance of the thing. The garrison assembled in the courtyard on the morning of the month's last day. Not summoned, not ordered, assembled, in the way that communities of people who share a significant experience sometimes organized themselves around the acknowledgement of it. Theron's reserve, still present for the final logistics of their withdrawal, added their numbers. The household staff, Senna, Yael, Mira, standing slightly apart from the group in the way she stood slightly apart from most groups, her power visible in the air around her at its resting level, which was higher than most people's maximum. Brennan, who had organized nothing and claimed credit for nothing, was nevertheless standing at the front of it in the way he was always standing at the front of things when they mattered. Alira came out of the keep at the second hour of the morning and found the courtyard full of people looking at her and understood, in the specific way she had been developing over 3 weeks, what was happening. Ronan was beside her. "You didn't arrange this," she said quietly. Not a question. "No," he said. "Did Brennan arranged the refreshments afterward," Ronan said. "Everything else arranged itself." She looked at the courtyard, at the faces of the garrison who had stood on the battlements while she froze the approach, at Theron's reserve, who had watched the field from the walls, at Mira, who was watching from the courtyard's edge with an expression that was doing something complicated in the direction of what complicated expressions do when they're made of mostly good things. At Sina, who had her notebook and was crying quietly and making no effort to conceal this, which was more honest than most people managed. Brennan took one step forward. He was the kind of man who, when he took one step forward, had the effect of the world paying attention. "Alpha Queen," he said. His voice carried to the full courtyard without being raised. "The Northern Territories have the custom, held since the Second Era, of a public acknowledgement when a new permanent authority takes their standing." He paused. The custom was not observed at the wedding, for reasons that have since become legendary. A brief pause, calibrated perfectly, that produced a ripple of something lighter through the assembled faces. "The custom is observed now." He bowed. Not the bow of an inferior to a superior, the bow of an equal acknowledging a peer. The specific angle that conveyed respect rather than subordination, the bow that Northfall's second-in-command gave to the Alpha King in formal ceremony. He gave it to Alira. The garrison followed. Then Theron's reserve. Then the household. Not all of them, not every face. There were people in that courtyard who were still in the process of revising, who would spend months finishing the revision, who would look back on this morning years later and understand what it had meant. But most of them. Enough of them that the counting didn't matter. Mira, from the edge, did not bow. She wasn't Northern, and the custom wasn't hers, and she met Alira's eyes across the courtyard with the expression of someone who has no appropriate gesture for what they are feeling and has decided that visibility is enough. Alira looked at the courtyard for a long moment. She stood very still. Not the practiced stillness, not the 12 years of management, not the composure that had been a container rather than a self. Just still, the way a person is still when they are fully present in the moment they are standing in and have no need to be anywhere else. Then she looked at Ronan. He was watching her with his full attention. The wolf instinct reading her completely, the 30 years of built self finding its complementary weight in what she carried, the bond between them running quiet and certain as a river that has found its course and no longer needs to negotiate with the landscape. "You did plan this," she said, very quietly, only for him. "I may have told Brennan when the garrison was likely to be assembled," he said. "That's planning," she said. "That's information," he said. "What they did with it was their own." She looked at him for another moment. The second nature was present. She never fully recalled it now. It existed in equilibrium with her human nature the way Cinna's mother's notes had predicted, balanced and sustainable and entirely hers. The light played off the frost in the courtyard the way it always played off frost in Northfall, indifferently, without intention, the physics of the place proceeding as they always had. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to thank me for—" "Ronan," she said, his name, plainly. "Thank you." He looked at her. "You're welcome," he said. Bookend. Spring came to Northfall in the way spring always came there, slowly, against significant resistance, the winter releasing its claim on the mountains with the specific reluctance of something that had occupied a space for a long time and didn't see why it should leave. The passes opened in degrees. The road to the south became navigable. Riders moved in both directions with the resuming hum of a world that had been compressed by the cold into essential transactions, and was now expanding back into its full complexity. The treaty with House Voss was renegotiated. The terms were different from the original, more equal, more specific, reflecting a relationship that had moved past its political origins into something that required more precise language. Alira conducted most of the negotiation herself, in correspondence, in the precise and methodical way she conducted everything. Her father's letters were carefully written and carefully answered, the accounting between them long and not simple, requiring more than the spring to complete. The Hollowed sent no further forces. The commander who had stood in the field and removed his helm had, according to the intelligence that began flowing back through the spring routes, returned to the organization with an account of what he had witnessed that was causing, within the Hollowed's leadership, a fracture that had been growing for decades and had found, in the field at Northfall, the event that made the fracture visible. Whether that fracture would produce reform or collapse was not Northfall's immediate concern. What it produced, functionally, was quiet. And quiet was what the North had been trying to achieve for 7 years by other means. Senna finished her mother's documentation in the spring. She presented it to Elira and Mira together in the library, with the focused, emotionally managed expression of someone performing an act that was both academic and personal, and both sisters read it with the attention it deserved. And when they had finished, Elira looked at Senna and said, "Your mother was the most important scholar the North has produced in 2 generations, and no one knows her name." "She preferred it that way," Senna said. "She thought the work was the point." "The work is the point," Elira agreed. "But the name should be known." She paused. "I'm going to see to it." Senna looked at her, the sharp, watchful expression that was her default interface with the world. Then something underneath it, something younger and less armored, something that had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly that. "All right," she said, and went back to her notes. On a morning in late spring, Ronan found Elira on the eastern battlement, not the north battlement, which had become functionally associated with the battle and retained a certain weight of reference. The eastern battlement, which faced the direction the sun came from and caught the morning light first and had no particular military significance, just height and view, and the mountains going from shadow to gold in the daily recurrence of Northfall's most reliable phenomenon. She was watching the light move. He came to stand beside her. The bond was what it always was, present and quiet, the calibrated frequency. The wolf and the star having long since stopped negotiating and started simply existing in the same register. "The Southern delegation arrives tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. "They'll want to renegotiate the border agreements." "They always do." This time from a position of, she paused. "Curiosity, I think. They've heard about the battle. The accounts that have traveled south are," she paused again, with the quality of someone choosing her words from a larger available vocabulary. "Significant." "Yes," he said. "They are." She looked at the mountains. The gold was moving down the rock, reaching the midpoint of the peaks, beginning to fill the shadow in the valleys below. "Mira is staying," Elira said. "She told me this morning. She's not going back south." "I know," Ronan said. "She told Yael yesterday." Elira turned to look at him. "Yael before me?" "Mira and Yael have been meeting every morning for 6 weeks," Ronan said. "They have an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "The kind that involves Mira's power and Yael's research interests and a degree of mutual benefit that neither of them has explained to anyone in detail." He paused. "I've decided not to ask." Elira looked at him. The almost smile, fully present now, no longer almost anything. "That's very unlike you." "I'm expanding my range," he said. She turned back to the mountains. The gold had reached the valley floors, the shadow retreating to its daytime position, and Northfall was fully lit. All its hard angles, all its permanent stone, all its indifference made visible and somehow, in the morning light, beautiful in the specific way of things that don't try to be beautiful and are anyway. "I didn't expect any of this," she said. "No," he said. "The bond, the council, the battle." She paused. "You?" "No," he said. "I was in that carriage for 3 days," she said, "counting the ways this arrangement would end badly. I had 12 scenarios. She looked at him. None of them ended here. And here is... He left the sentence open, not asking exactly, more making room for the answer. Here's the first place I've been that doesn't require me to be smaller than I am, she said. The simplicity of it, the plainness, the complete absence of performance around what was, for her, the most significant thing she had said since arriving in the North. That's not... She paused. I know that's not... It's everything, he said. She looked at him. The morning light was full on her face, and the second nature was visible in the quality of the air around her. And she was herself, all of herself, both natures, fully present and fully standing, the woman who had spent 12 years learning to be still, so the power didn't spill, and had discovered that the stillness was the cage, not the freedom. It's everything, she agreed. The mountains were gold all the way down now, the valley shadows gone, the day fully arrived and fully itself. Below them, Northfall was waking into its morning business. The garrison changing, the kitchen smoke rising, Senna already in the library by the schedule she kept, Mira somewhere with Yael, Brennan probably already in the war room with fresh reports from the spring routes. The world proceeding, as it always did, as it always would. We have a delegation tomorrow, Illyra said. Yes, Ronan said. And the border agreements, yes. And the revised Northern law. She paused. Senna wants to present the research to the Northern Scholars' Assembly in summer. She should, he said. And Mira's situation needs formal legal recognition before the Highland Lords make it complicated. Yes, he said. She looked at the mountains, at the territory that was hers now, not only by marriage, not only by the bond, but by everything that had happened in the space between a wedding hall and a field and a highland clearing and an open courtyard, by the work of it. We have a lot to do, she said. We always will, he said. She turned from the mountains and looked at him, fully, the way she had been looking at him for weeks now, with nothing managed and nothing held back, just present and clear and entirely her. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories, who had walked into a wedding as a treaty and found something he had spent 30 years not knowing he was looking for, looked back. All right, she said. 2 words. The same 2 words she had said in a physician's room on the first night, braced for the harder answer and finding the easier one. The same words and entirely different, grown into what they had always had the potential to become, spoken now not from bracing but from choosing. All right, he said. Below them, Northfall held its breath in the way it always held its breath in the morning, that brief interval between the night's accounting and the day's demands, when the world exists in the unclaimed space between what it has been and what it is about to become. Then the day began, and they went to meet it together.